My family arranged a surprise event solely to humiliate me. In front of 50 elite guests, my father stood at a podium and began reading a detailed list of my sister's supposed achievements, followed immediately by a cruel inventory of my personal and professional mistakes. I sat there quietly letting him finish his theatrical performance. Then I walked up to the microphone, said just one sentence, and hit play on a recording I had captured earlier. Within minutes of that audio echoing through the ballroom, 5 relationships in that very room ended forever, and my family lost everything they had built their fake empire upon. My name is Rebecca. I am 33 years old, and for my entire life I was treated as the ultimate disappointment by the people who should have loved me most. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled their perfect facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic relatives who severely underestimated your intelligence. It was a crisp Saturday evening in Northern California. I was driving my car up the winding cypress-lined driveway of the Oak Ridge Country Club in Napa Valley. The invitation I had received a month prior was elegantly embossed with gold lettering, explicitly stating it was a celebration for my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. Richard and Caroline. My parents had always loved throwing lavish parties to remind their wealthy friends of their financial status. I had debated not attending at all. Our relationship was strained at best, completely toxic at worst. But a small naive part of me thought that showing up to honor their milestone might mend some of the broken bridges between us. I handed my keys to the valet and adjusted the neckline of my dress before walking up the wide stone steps. The double mahogany doors were propped open, and the faint sound of a classical string quartet drifted into the cool evening air. I stepped into the grand foyer fully prepared to paste on a polite smile and survive a few hours of superficial small talk. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. Spanning the entire width of the grand archway leading into the main ballroom was a massive, professionally printed silk banner. It did not say Happy Anniversary. In bold, glittering letters it read, Honoring Family Achievements. Below that overarching title were huge, glossy photographs of my father, Richard, my mother, Caroline, and my younger sister, Brittany. There was absolutely no mention or image of me anywhere. I stared at the banner, a familiar cold knot forming in my stomach. This was not an anniversary dinner. This was a calculated showcase designed specifically to elevate my sister, the family golden child, while deliberately erasing my existence. Before I could process the deception, the sharp clicking of designer heels echoed across the marble floor. My mother, Caroline, marched directly toward me. She wore a champagne-colored gown dripping with expensive beadwork, her hair sprayed into a rigid, perfect style. Trailing closely behind her were 3 women I recognized as the most notoriously judgmental socialites in their country club circle. Caroline did not offer a hug, or even a basic greeting. Instead, she grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging into my skin, and pulled me slightly away from the entrance. Her eyes raked up and down my body with undisguised contempt. I really did not think you would actually have the nerve to show up tonight, she said, her voice pitched loud enough for her wealthy friends to hear. She let out a dry, condescending laugh, and wearing that no less. With your meager accounting salary, I suppose you had to skip meals for a month just to afford something off the clearance rack at a department store. The 3 women behind her exchanged amused glances, whispering behind their champagne flutes. I kept my face completely blank, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was so desperate to provoke. Caroline leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper. Listen to me very carefully, Rebecca. Brittany paid $10,000 to hire a professional photographer from Vogue for tonight. This evening is about success and beauty. I do not want your tired, miserable face ruining the aesthetic of our family portraits. When the photographer comes around, you will make yourself scarce. Go hide at the bar or stay in the restroom. Just stay out of the frame. Do you understand me? For years, I would have shrunk away, apologizing and internalizing the cruel shame she was projecting onto me. But I was no longer the scared girl desperate for her validation. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm, smoothing out the fabric she had wrinkled. I smiled, letting my gaze drift lazily over her overly dramatic gown, before locking eyes with her. "Actually, Mom," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to the eavesdropping socialites. "This dress is a custom piece from Armani, and I am not a standard accountant. I am a forensic accountant, working directly for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We specialize in tracking down corporate fraud, embezzlement, and offshore tax evasion. You know, the exact kind of crimes that usually send people who frequent this specific country club to federal prison." The three socialites suddenly looked terrified, their whispered gossiping halting completely as they took a synchronized step back from me. Caroline's face drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Humiliated, she spun on her heel and stormed away toward the ballroom doors. I followed at a distance, watching her frantically grab the arm of Trent, my father's business partner. As I passed them, I clearly overheard her frantic, venomous whisper. "We need to accelerate the plan, Trent. We are forcing her to sign away her rights tonight." I stopped and smiled. Perfect. I stepped through the arched double doors and into the main ballroom, leaving my mother fuming in the hallway. The sheer audacity of the display before me was staggering. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 50 of the most influential people in the valley. Waiters in immaculate white coats glided across the polished hardwood floors, carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and imported caviar. At the center of the room, my father Richard was holding court. He threw his head back in a booming, practiced laugh, clapping a local real estate developer on the shoulder. From the outside, it was a flawless picture of generational wealth and unshakable success. But I was not an outsider looking in. I was a forensic accountant, and my entire career was built on looking past the sparkling surface to find the financial rot underneath. I moved quietly along the perimeter of the room, taking a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. I leaned against a marble pillar, letting the shadows conceal me as my investigative instincts fully took over. I stopped seeing them as my family and started analyzing them as targets in an active investigation. Every single interaction in that room was heavily choreographed. My mother had already recovered from our encounter in the lobby and was currently clinging to the arm of a powerful tech executive. Her smile stretched so tight it looked painful. Across the room, my sister Brittany was treating the event like her personal runway. She posed dramatically for the expensive photographer, tossing her hair and flashing her diamond rings, acting as if she were royalty, gracing the commoners with her presence. Yet beneath the expensive veneer, I could see the frantic energy, the rapid blinking, the forced, high-pitched laughter. It was the distinct, unmistakable body language of people drowning in debt and desperate to maintain the illusion of solvency. I knew my father's brokerage firm had been losing major clients over the past year. I had heard the whispers in the financial district. Tonight was not a celebration of family achievements. It was a fundraising pitch wrapped in a lavish party, a desperate attempt to reassure investors that the family empire was thriving. And according to my mother's whispered panic in the lobby, I was somehow the key to their financial salvation. "Well, hello there, stranger." The voice was smooth, arrogant, and entirely unwelcome. I did not have to turn around to know it was Trent. He slid into the space next to me, leaning his forearm against the marble pillar, intentionally invading my personal space to assert dominance. Trent was 35, slickly handsome, and wore a custom-tailored suit that screamed new money. He was my father's junior business partner, but more importantly, he was Brittany's secret lover. I had known about their ongoing affair for months, having traced a series of highly questionable hotel charges during a routine background check I ran on my own family for security clearance purposes. "Trent," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the crowd, "I am surprised you have time to mingle. Usually you are too busy running errands for my father or fetching drinks for my sister." Trent let out a low, patronizing chuckle. He shifted his weight, trying to project an aura of effortless superiority. Always so defensive, Rebecca. It is a real shame you never learned how to play the game. You could have been part of all this wealth and prestige. Instead, you chose to isolate yourself with your boring little government job. You always had to be the difficult, stubborn black sheep of the family. I finally turned to look at him, my expression completely flat. My government job pays me to put white-collar criminals in federal prison. I would say I play the game exceptionally well. Trent sneered, clearly unimpressed by my response. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick black leather legal folder. He tapped it against his palm rhythmically, a smug, predatory grin spreading across his face. You talk a big game for someone who is completely out of her depth. You walked into the lion's den tonight, Rebecca. You think you are so smart and so fiercely independent, but by the time this party is over, you are going to experience a very humbling night. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cheap cigars. Your father has prepared a beautiful presentation for you. We are going to break you down piece by piece right in front of all these people until you realize that you are absolutely nothing without this family. You are going to sign your inheritance over to Brittany, and you will walk out of here with nothing, just like you deserve. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I let my eyes drift slowly downward, ignoring his pathetic threats entirely, and focused my absolute attention on the leather folder he was gripping so tightly. It was meant to look like a generic legal portfolio, the kind attorneys carry to high-stakes corporate closings. But Trent was careless and arrogant. He was holding the folder backward, inadvertently exposing the subtle embossed emblem stamped into the bottom right corner of the leather binding. My breath caught in my throat, though I maintained my icy, unbothered facade. I recognized that specific logo instantly. It was a crest featuring two crossed keys over a shield. It was the exclusive emblem of the Grand Cayman Sovereign Bank. It was an elite, highly secretive offshore institution known for facilitating untraceable transactions for the ultra-wealthy. More importantly, it was the exact bank my federal task force had been investigating for the past 8 months for facilitating massive international wire fraud and money laundering schemes. The puzzle pieces clicked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. This was not just a petty family squabble over a grandfather's trust fund. My father and Trent were not just trying to steal my inheritance to cover a few bad investments. They were moving massive amounts of money offshore. They were actively involved in a federal crime network, and they needed my $5 million to finalize a fraudulent wire transfer before the federal auditors kicked their doors down. They thought they had backed a naive, helpless daughter into a corner. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed a federal investigator the exact piece of physical evidence she needed to destroy their entire criminal enterprise. The sheer arrogance of carrying that specific folder into a room full of potential witnesses was staggering, but it fit Trent perfectly. He believed he was invincible because my father had shielded him from the consequences of his actions for years. I looked back up into Trent's smug, punchable face. He was still waiting for a reaction, waiting for my eyes to well up with tears, or for my shoulders to slump in defeat. He wanted me to beg. Instead, I offered him a polite, chilling smile. I reached out and gently patted the lapel of his expensive suit jacket. I am really looking forward to this presentation, Trent, I told him, keeping my voice soft and steady. I hope you and my father have your affairs in perfect order, because I promise you tonight is going to be unforgettable for everyone involved. Trent frowned, clearly unsettled by my lack of fear, but before he could respond, the ballroom lights began to dim. As the ballroom lights began to dim, Trent shot me one last malicious grin before melting back into the crowd of wealthy socialites. I let out a slow, controlled breath, steadying my heart rate. I made my way toward the marble-topped bar. I took a fresh glass of sparkling water, scanning the room. Rebecca, it is so good to see you tonight. I turned to see Jamal approaching, a genuinely warm smile spreading across his handsome face. Jamal was my brother-in-law, Brittany's husband, and the only decent person in my family. He was an African-American investment banker from a prominent Atlanta family. His parents were respected academics who built their wealth on hard work. Jamal had always treated me with profound respect, completely ignoring the toxic narrative my parents constantly pushed about me being the bitter, failed older sister. He wore a tailored navy tuxedo that contrasted with the flashy outfits my father favored. "Jamal," I said, allowing a real smile to cross my face. "I am glad you are here. How have you been holding up in this circus?" He let out a rich laugh, ordering a bourbon. "You know how Richard and Caroline are with parties. Everything must be louder than last year, but I am genuinely happy you made it. Brittany said you were swamped and would not show. I told her we should have sent a car for you." "Of course she said that," I thought. I kept my tone light. "My job is busy, but I would not miss this. You look exhausted, though. Long week at the firm." Jamal ran a hand over his hair, shoulders slumping. He sipped his bourbon and leaned against the brass rail. "It has been a wild month, honestly. I have been working constantly to liquidate personal portfolios and free up capital. But it is for a good cause. A great cause, actually. I am really proud of Brittany." My forensic instincts instantly went on high alert. Brittany had never worked a day in her life. She spent her days taking selfies at luxury gyms, pretending to be a social media influencer funded entirely by my parents and Jamal. "Proud of her for what, Jamal?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. He beamed, his eyes lighting up with absolute pride. "She is launching her own lifestyle wellness brand. It is a massive undertaking. Organic skincare, high-end wellness, retreats, the whole package. Richard and Trent brought the business plan to me last month. The market projections are absolutely incredible. I am officially the primary angel investor. I just authorized the final wire transfer this morning. $2 million straight from my family's Atlanta trust into her new corporate account." The air in my lungs turned to ice. $2 million, the exact amount needed to trigger federal reporting flags unless routed through an offshore shell corporation. A shell corporation set up by someone using a Grand Cayman sovereign bank portfolio. Trent. I looked at Jamal, seeing the absolute trust and love in his eyes. He was a brilliant investment banker, but he was blinded by his love for his wife and his ingrained respect for his father-in-law. They had weaponized his good nature to fund their exit strategy. They were not building a wellness brand. They were stealing his family's generational wealth to cover the massive deficit in my father's brokerage firm before the federal auditors arrived. "Jamal," I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping seamlessly into the precise clinical tone I used when interrogating corporate suspects in federal holding rooms. "I need you to answer 3 very specific questions for me right now, and I need you to think very carefully before you speak." His smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild confusion. He set his bourbon down on the marble counter. "Okay, you are acting very serious right now, Rebecca. What is going on?" Question 1. I said, maintaining intense eye contact. "Did you personally review the filed articles of incorporation for this wellness brand, and is Brittany listed as the sole managing member, or is the primary shareholder listed as an anonymous, limited liability company?" Jamal blinked. "Well, Trent handled the filing to save time. He said it was a standard corporate umbrella structure to protect our personal assets." Question 2. I continued, ignoring the cold dread spreading through my chest. "The $2 million you wired this morning? Did the routing number match a domestic commercial bank, or did Trent instruct you to route the funds through a correspondent banking account located outside of the United States?" The color began to drain from Jamal's face. The ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to fade away as he stared at me. He gave me specific routing instructions. He said their international distribution partner required an escrow deposit in the Caribbean to secure the raw materials. I leaned in closer, my voice barely a whisper. Question 3. Jamal, have you seen the actual physical tax documents and the employer identification number for this company? Or have you only seen the glossy financial projections and colorful charts that Trent printed out for you? Jamal froze completely. He opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He managed billions of dollars for institutional clients every day. He knew the strict protocols of due diligence, the absolute necessity of verifying tax documents, and the massive red flags associated with offshore escrow routing. But because it was his wife, his father-in-law, and their trusted business partner, he had completely bypassed his own professional safeguards. He had handed over $2 million of his family's legacy, based on nothing but slick promises and colorful spreadsheets. He stared down at his empty hands, his breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. "Oh my God. I never saw the tax documents, Rebecca. I only ever saw Trent's projections." His voice broke on the last word. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him, suffocating the joyous pride he had carried into the room just minutes earlier. Jamal was a man who handled complex mergers and acquisitions for a living. He built his entire career in Atlanta on being the smartest, most meticulous guy in the boardroom. But family dynamics had a terrifying way of bypassing professional logic. He had trusted them because they were his wife's blood. He had let his guard down. "Show it to me," I commanded, keeping my tone perfectly level to prevent him from spiraling into a panic attack right there at the bar. "Pull up the digital pitch deck Trent sent you. I want to see the exact file you used to authorize that wire transfer." Jamal fumbled in the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His hands were physically shaking as he pulled out his smartphone. He hastily unlocked the screen, swiped through his email application, and opened a high-resolution PDF document. He handed the phone to me. The cover page was splashed with pastel colors, elegant typography, and a title that read Aura Wellness Retreats and Botanicals. It looked expensive. It looked professional. It looked exactly like the kind of sophisticated bait designed to separate wealthy investors from their money. I completely bypassed the glowing mission statements, the stock photographs of women doing yoga on pristine beaches, and the fabricated celebrity endorsement quotes. As a forensic accountant for the federal government, I knew that liars always dressed their deceptions in beautiful packaging. I scrolled aggressively past the marketing fluff and went straight to the back of the deck. The appendix, the operational budgets, the supply chain logistics, the vendor allocation lists. It took me exactly 45 seconds to spot the glaring financial anomalies. The entire structure was a house of cards mathematically designed to fail while looking wildly successful on paper. "Look at this, Jamal," I said, stepping closer to him so our voices would not carry over the background music. "Look at these projected operating margins. Trent is claiming a 92% profit margin on organic, ethically sourced botanical skincare products in their very first fiscal quarter. That is statistically impossible in the current global supply chain market. Even established conglomerates do not see those margins. They put that number there because it triggers a psychological response. It triggers greed." Jamal swallowed hard, staring at the screen over my shoulder. "Trent said they had secured exclusive manufacturing rights. He said the overhead was virtually non-existent because they were cutting out the middlemen." "There is no manufacturing, Jamal," I stated with absolute certainty. "Look right here at the primary vendor allocation. This is where your $2 million just went." I pointed to a specific line item on the expenditure sheet. It listed a company called Suncrest Global Distributions as the sole supplier for all raw materials, packaging, and retreat logistics. They were essentially receiving 90% of the startup capital up front as a retainer fee. Trent told me Suncrest was a premium supplier based out of Miami. Jamal whispered, his eyes scanning the spreadsheet. He said he had a personal, long-standing relationship with their chief executive officer. He swore they were legitimate. "Trent is a liar, and he is counting on the fact that you love your wife too much to audit her father's best friend." I zoomed in on the screen, isolating a tiny block of text buried in the fine print at the very bottom of the page. "Suncrest Global is not based in Miami. Look at the routing address registered for their corporate accounts." Jamal squinted at the glowing screen. The address listed was a post office box located in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my voice deadpan. This is a shell corporation, Jamal. It is the exact same offshore setup my federal task force investigates every single day. They use these Cayman Island post office boxes to create phantom vendors. You wire the money to the corporate account, the funds are immediately funneled through a correspondent bank to wash the trail, and the money disappears into an untraceable offshore trust. Your $2 million is not buying organic skincare products. It is sitting in a Caribbean account controlled by Trent and my father. Jamal gripped the edge of the marble bar so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing was ragged. He was an intelligent, powerful man, and the humiliation of being conned by his own in-laws was visibly tearing him apart. $2 million, he choked out, staring blankly at the ice melting in his bourbon glass. That was money my grandparents worked their entire lives to build. It was trust money meant for our future children. Brittany knew this. She sat on our couch, looked me in the eye, and told me this wellness brand was her life's dream. She begged me to believe in her. I needed to warn him about the rest of it. I needed to tell him that his wife was not just a naive participant in her father's scheme, but a willing, calculated accomplice. I needed to tell him about the hotel charges I had traced between Brittany and Trent. I opened my mouth to deliver the final, devastating blow to tell him that the woman he loved was currently sleeping with the man who just stole his family's legacy. But before I could speak a single word, the classical string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The heavy brass doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open with a dramatic thud. A bright spotlight swung across the ballroom, illuminating the landing. The idle chatter of the 50 elite guests faded into an expectant silence. Brittany made her grand theatrical entrance. She wore a backless emerald green evening gown that clung tightly to her figure, shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. She looked absolutely radiant, soaking up the attention of the room like a sponge. She paused at the top of the stairs, posing for the Vogue photographer, who immediately began snapping pictures. But what made my blood boil, and what made Jamal freeze completely beside me, was who she was standing with. She was not looking around the room for her husband. She was not searching the crowd to share this triumph with the man who had just bankrolled her entire fake company. Instead, Brittany was clinging tightly to Trent's arm. Her hand was resting flat against his chest, her fingers lightly tracing the lapel of his tuxedo. She leaned into him, whispering something in his ear that made him throw his head back and laugh. The physical intimacy between them was blatant, arrogant, and undeniable. She was parading her secret lover in front of her husband, her parents, and the entire country club, completely confident that her perfect, untouchable facade would protect her from any consequences. The ballroom erupted into polite, synchronized applause as Brittany and Trent reached the bottom of the grand staircase. The photographer circled them like a shark, capturing every manufactured smile and lingering touch. Beside me, Jamal stood as still as a statue carved from solid ice. The sheer volume of the betrayal was paralyzing him. He was a man who relied on logic, data, and risk assessment, and right now every single metric was telling him that his entire marriage was a fraudulent enterprise. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, a silent anchor in the middle of the storm, urging him to keep his composure just a little longer. Before Jamal could process the devastating reality of the offshore bank accounts, Brittany spotted us standing at the marble bar. She whispered something to Trent, her glossy lips brushing against his jawline, in a display of intimacy that made my stomach turn. Trent smirked, adjusting his jacket, and the two of them began navigating through the crowd toward us. At that exact moment, Jamal's parents approached the bar from the opposite direction. Dr. Calvin and Professor Beatrice were the epitome of Atlanta high society, radiating quiet dignity and academic grace. They had flown across the country specifically to support their daughter-in-law and her new wellness venture. They stepped up next to Jamal, their expressions shifting from warm anticipation to mild confusion as they noticed Trent hovering aggressively close to Brittany's side. Brittany did not embrace her husband. She did not greet her wealthy in-laws with the respect they deserved. Instead, her eyes locked onto me like a heat-seeking missile. The moment she was within earshot, the golden child mask slipped, revealing the vicious, insecure bully underneath. Rebecca Brittany announced, her voice pitched artificially high so that at least a dozen surrounding guests turned their heads to listen. I am honestly shocked the bouncers let you through the front gate. I specifically told Mother not to invite you. This is a celebration of actual achievements, not a support group for women who cannot keep a man. Jamal's parents stiffened instantly. Professor Beatrice's jaw dropped slightly, utterly appalled by the sheer lack of class Brittany was displaying in a room full of esteemed guests. Jamal opened his mouth to intervene, his fists clenching at his sides, but the shock of the $2 million theft was still anchoring him to the floor. I shot him a sharp, covert glance, silently commanding him to stand down. I needed Brittany to keep talking. I needed her to dig her own grave as deeply as possible. I am here to support the family, Brittany, I replied, keeping my vocal tone perfectly modulated and entirely devoid of emotion, just like everyone else in this room. Support the family. Brittany scoffed loudly, waving her manicured hand dismissively. Please, you do not know the first thing about supporting anyone. You are just here to spread your toxic misery because you cannot stand seeing me succeed. It has been 5 years since your spectacular failure of an engagement, Rebecca. 5 years since you got dumped weeks before walking down the aisle because you were too obsessed with your depressing government job to actually be a decent partner. The surrounding guests went entirely silent. The string quartet playing in the background suddenly sounded overwhelmingly loud. Dr. Calvin placed a protective hand on his wife's back, exchanging a horrified look with her. They were highly educated, refined people, and they were watching their son's wife throw a reality television-style temper tantrum in the middle of a prestigious country club. Brittany took a step closer to me, dragging Trent along with her. Trent wore a smug, self-satisfied grin, clearly enjoying the public execution he thought was taking place. You are nothing but a bitter, lonely spinster. Brittany spat, her voice echoing off the marble pillars. You have no husband. You have no business acumen. You have absolutely no concept of what it takes to build a legacy. Jamal and I have a perfect marriage and a thriving empire. You are just hovering around my husband tonight, whispering in his ear, trying to ruin my perfect life out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. You want him to doubt me because nobody has ever looked at you the way Jamal looks at me. The sheer audacity of her statement was breathtaking. She was openly accusing me of trying to sabotage her marriage while she was physically leaning against the man she was sleeping with. She was weaponizing my canceled engagement, a relationship I had ended myself after discovering my ex-fiancé was hiding crippling gambling debts to humiliate me in front of high society. She expected me to break. She expected me to raise my voice, to cry, or to storm out of the ballroom in shame. That was how the family dynamic had always worked. Richard and Caroline would set the stage, and Brittany would deliver the crushing blow. Jamal finally found his voice. His tone was dangerously low, carrying a lethal edge I had never heard from him before. Brittany, he warned, his eyes locked on his wife. That is enough. Step away from Trent and lower your voice right now. Brittany blinked, genuinely taken aback by Jamal's harsh command. She was used to him being the compliant, supportive husband who smoothed over her abrasive behavior. But Trent stepped forward, puffing out his chest to shield Brittany entirely, overstepping his boundaries as a mere business partner. Relax. Jamal Trent intervened smoothly, flashing his bright, expensive veneers. Brittany is just stressed from the launch. And let us be honest, Rebecca brings a very negative energy to these upscale events. We all just want to focus on the future of the company tonight. I did not yell. I did not defend my past relationships, and I certainly did not apologize for my presence. As an investigator, I knew that letting the suspect believe they were in control was the fastest way to extract a confession. I reached out and took a fresh crystal flute of champagne from a passing waiter. I held the glass by the stem, bringing it slowly to my lips, maintaining absolute terrifying eye contact with my sister. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne. The icy liquid slid down my throat, matching the absolute freezing calm taking over my nervous system. I lowered the glass. I did not look at Brittany's furious face, nor did I look at Jamal's horrified parents. Instead, I let my gaze drop with clinical precision. I stared directly, unblinking, at Trent's wrist. The silence that followed Brittany's outburst was thick and suffocating. I kept my eyes locked on Trent's left wrist, where his tuxedo sleeve had ridden up just enough to expose the heavy, gleaming timepiece secured there. The ambient chatter of the ballroom felt miles away. I let the tension stretch, forcing them to endure the uncomfortable quiet. Brittany's chest heaved with angry breaths, waiting for me to engage in the screaming match she desperately craved. She wanted a scene. I was going to give her an execution. You are absolutely right, Brittany. I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of the bitterness she had tried to provoke. I offered her a serene, unbothered smile that made her eyes narrow in confusion. I have absolutely no concept of building a legacy the way you do. Your life is truly a masterclass in aggressive networking. Brittany blinked, thrown entirely off balance by my calm agreement. She had expected a fight, not a concession. Trent puffed out his chest, assuming I was retreating. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms in a display of arrogant victory. That simple movement caused his jacket sleeve to pull back another inch, fully exposing the watch face under the bright crystal chandeliers. I did not look at my sister again. I turned my attention entirely to my brother-in-law, whose jaw was still clenched tight from Brittany's public disrespect. Jamal, I said, my tone shifting into casual, polite curiosity. I could not help but notice the timepiece Trent is wearing tonight. Is that not the limited edition Patek Philippe Nautilus? The specific model you purchased during your global banking summit in Geneva last October. The one featuring the custom rose gold clasp and the sapphire crystal backing. The question hung in the air, sharp and precise as a scalpel. I knew exactly what that watch was. Jamal had shown it to me proudly at a family dinner months ago. It was a rare, intricate piece of horology that cost more than most people made in a decade. It was not the kind of watch a junior business partner like Trent could ever afford on his salary. It was a status symbol reserved for men operating at Jamal's level of generational wealth and executive power. Jamal frowned, his brow furrowing as he processed my question. He turned his head, his gaze tracking down to Trent's crossed arms. The light caught the rose gold clasp perfectly. Jamal froze. The sophisticated, composed investment banker vanished, replaced by a man suddenly staring at a ghost. His eyes locked onto the watch, recognizing every custom detail, every micro scratch on the bezel of his own property. The air temperature between us seemed to plummet 20 degrees. Brittany, Jamal said, his voice dropping into a terrifying, hollow monotone. He did not look at his wife. He kept his eyes dead fixed on Trent's wrist. Brittany told me she took that exact watch to the private jeweler on Fifth Avenue for a professional ultrasonic cleaning 2 weeks ago. She said the jeweler needed to keep it off-site for a month to service the internal movement. The reaction from the guilty parties was instantaneous and spectacular. Brittany let out a sharp, strangled gasp. All the color drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. Her golden child confidence shattered into a million pieces. She opened her mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless stutter came out. Jamal, it is not. I mean, the jeweler said. Brittany stammered, her hands fluttering nervously in front of her. She was frantically searching her brain for a lie that could explain why her husband's $250,000 watch was currently strapped to her supposed business partner. She had nothing. Trent realized his catastrophic mistake a second too late. Panic flashed across his smug face. With a violent, jerky motion, he uncrossed his arms and aggressively yanked his tuxedo sleeve down, desperate to cover the watch. He took a hasty step back, bumping into a passing waiter and nearly knocking over a tray of champagne. "It is a replica," Trent blurted out, his voice cracking under the pressure. His arrogant facade had completely evaporated. "It is just a good replica, Jamal. I bought it online to celebrate the launch. It is not yours." Nobody believed him. The lie was so flimsy, so incredibly stupid, that it only served to validate his guilt. Doctor Calvin and Professor Beatrice exchanged horrified glances. They were brilliant people, and they did not need a federal investigator to explain the implications of a wife giving her husband's most prized possession to another man. The offshore accounts, the secret hotel charges, the stolen $2 million, it was all spiraling around this one undeniable piece of physical evidence. Jamal took a slow, measured step toward Trent. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. He was several inches taller than Trent, and the fury radiating off him was palpable. He did not yell, he did not cause a scene. He simply extended his hand, palm up, his eyes burning with a cold, absolute rage. "Take the watch off, Trent," Jamal commanded, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. "Take it off right now and hand it to me." Trent swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at Brittany for help, but she was paralyzed, her hands covering her mouth in sheer terror. The flawless empire she thought she controlled was burning to the ground right in front of her. I watched the destruction unfold, my heart pounding with cold satisfaction. The trap had sprung perfectly. I had them cornered, and the truth was finally dragging them into the light. But before Trent could unbuckle the stolen watch, and before Jamal could demand the answers that would inevitably tear this family apart, a massive, heavy hand clamped down on my upper arm. The grip was vicious fingers digging brutally into my bicep, pressing hard enough to instantly bruise the skin beneath my silk sleeve. I gasped, the sudden physical pain breaking my focus. I was yanked backward with staggering force, pulling me violently away from Jamal and the escalating confrontation. "Excuse us," a deep, furious voice hissed directly into my ear. It was my father, Richard. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, the charming host persona completely gone. The veins in his neck were bulging and his eyes were manic. He did not give me a chance to speak or resist. Using his substantial weight advantage, he shoved me forward, forcing me away from the crowded bar and out of the main ballroom. I stumbled in my heels, trying to pry his crushing fingers off my arm, but his grip was like an iron vice. He dragged me swiftly down a dimly lit, carpeted hallway, far away from the prying eyes of his 50 VIP guests, and shoved me roughly toward the heavy oak doors of a private executive study. I stumbled through the threshold of the study, the thick carpet absorbing the impact of my unsteady footing. Behind me, the heavy oak doors slammed shut with a resonant, booming thud that instantly severed all the music, laughter, and chatter from the glittering ballroom. The absolute silence of the room was deafening. I heard the sharp metallic slide of a deadbolt locking into place. My father had locked us inside. The executive study smelled of aged bourbon, expensive leather polish, and the heavy metallic scent of desperate fear. I straightened my posture, smoothing down the sleeve of my custom Armani dress, where his brutal grip had wrinkled the fine fabric. I did not rub my arm, refusing to show him even a fraction of physical weakness. I turned around slowly to face him. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his perfectly tailored tuxedo shirt. The jovial, magnetic patriarch who had been commanding the room minutes earlier was completely gone. In his place stood a frantic, cornered animal. He marched across the intricate Persian rug and stopped at a massive mahogany executive desk that dominated the center of the room. In his right hand, he gripped the black leather legal folder. He must have snatched it from Trent in the chaotic seconds before he dragged me away from the bar. He slammed the folder down onto the polished wood surface. The gold-embossed crest of the Grand Cayman Sovereign Bank gleamed under the amber light of the brass desk lamp. He flipped the cover open with violent urgency, his fingers trembling slightly as he flattened the thick, crisp pages inside. He reached into his inner pocket, produced a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen, and slammed it down right next to the paperwork. "We are done playing games, Rebecca." My father snarled, his voice a low, dangerous gravel that I had rarely heard during my childhood. "You have caused enough of a scene tonight. You are going to walk over to this desk, pick up that pen, and sign exactly where I have placed the yellow sticky notes. And then you are going to walk out the back exit of this country club, get in your car, and go back to your miserable, lonely life." I did not move toward the desk. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, maintaining a calculating, professional distance. I let my eyes scan the visible text of the document illuminated by the desk lamp. Even upside down and from 3 feet away, my specialized training as a federal forensic accountant allowed me to identify the exact nature of the paperwork. It was a beneficiary relinquishment form. I could see the notary seal was already stamped at the bottom of the page, meaning Trent had illegally bribed a corrupt official to preemptively authorize my signature. The date on the top margin was typed for tomorrow morning. They had planned this ambush down to the hour. The legal phrasing was aggressive and absolute. It was specifically drafted to sever all my legal rights, future claims, and current entitlements to the irrevocable trust fund established by my late grandfather. My grandfather, a shrewd man who had seen through my parents' superficial greed long before he passed away, had left a $5 million trust solely in my name, effectively bypassing my father entirely. The trust had a specific fail-safe clause built into its foundation. If I were to voluntarily surrender my rights as the primary beneficiary, the entire $5 million principal would automatically default to the secondary heir. That secondary heir was Brittany. I looked up from the fraudulent document and met my father's manic gaze. "You are attempting to extort me for $5 million, I stated, keeping my voice as flat and clinical as a weather report. "You dragged me into a locked room to force me to sign over grandfather's trust to Brittany." "It is not extortion, it is a course correction," Richard spat back, slamming his hand flat against the mahogany desk again. "That money belongs to this family. It belongs to the legacy of this family. Your grandfather was a senile old fool when he drafted that trust. You do not deserve a single cent of that wealth. You have contributed absolutely nothing to our reputation. You abandoned our social circles, you took a pathetic government job, and you consistently embarrass us with your sheer lack of ambition. Brittany is the future of this family. Brittany is building an empire." I almost laughed at the utter delusion of his statement. "Brittany is not building an empire, Dad. Brittany is playing dress-up while she actively conspires with your junior partner to steal $2 million from her husband. And you are facilitating the entire fraudulent operation through offshore shell accounts because your own brokerage firm is completely insolvent." The muscles in Richard's jaw twitched violently. A shadow of sheer terror passed over his eyes, instantly replaced by a boiling, toxic rage. The fact that I knew about the insolvency, the fact that I knew the exact mechanics of their financial crimes, stripped away his last remaining shred of parental pretense. He realized I was not just throwing blind accusations. I was reading his financial death warrant. "Sign the paper, Rebecca," he demanded, stepping out from behind the desk and closing the distance between us. His physical presence was meant to be highly intimidating, a tactic he used to bully junior brokers and frightened clients. But I held my ground, standing tall in my heels, staring straight into his furious eyes. "I will never sign that document," I replied, enunciating every single syllable with absolute clarity. "You cannot bully me into funding your criminal exit strategy. You are drowning in debt, the federal auditors are circling your firm, and you need my $5 million to finalize your offshore wire transfers before you end up in a federal penitentiary. I am not your savior, Dad. I am your reckoning." Richard stopped mere inches from my face. The charming, sophisticated father persona he had worn for 62 years completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a ruthless, desperate criminal. He raised his hand and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You arrogant, ungrateful little brat," he hissed, his voice vibrating with pure venom. "You think you are so clever. You think you can walk into my event and destroy everything I have built just because you figured out a few numbers on a spreadsheet. You are nothing. You have always been nothing to me. I am not asking you to sign this document, Rebecca. I am telling you, you are going to sign your name on that dotted line, and you are going to do it right now, because I promise you, you are not leaving this locked room until you do." I stared into the eyes of the man who had contributed half my DNA, finding absolutely nothing paternal left in his gaze. He expected me to cower. He expected the physical disparity between us to force my compliance. Instead, I held my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, my breathing meticulously controlled. I had sat across interrogation tables from hardened cartel leaders and embezzling sociopaths. A desperate aging broker in a rented tuxedo did not frighten me in the slightest. When I did not flinch, a tremor of genuine panic rippled through Richard's clenched jaw. He stepped back, pacing the length of the Persian rug, running a hand through his thinning, heavily styled hair. The charming host facade was completely broken. He was a drowning man, and the water was rising fast. "You do not understand the magnitude of what is happening here, Rebecca," he said, his voice losing its booming resonance, replaced by a frantic, breathless cadence. "The Securities and Exchange Commission has flagged my brokerage firm. They are sending a specialized team of federal auditors into my office next Thursday at 8 in the morning. If they look at the master ledger, if they see the actual balance sheets, I am finished. The firm is entirely insolvent. We have been bleeding capital for 3 straight years, trying to keep up with the market, trying to maintain the luxury lifestyle this family requires." He gestured wildly around the opulent leather-bound study, a physical representation of the wealth he was pretending to possess. The exclusive club memberships, the luxury cars, Britney's ridiculous lifestyle brand. "Do you have any idea what it costs to keep all of these plates spinning in the air? I had to borrow from my private client portfolios. It was only supposed to be a temporary bridge loan. I was going to put the capital back after Trent secured the international distribution deal for his real estate venture. But the market shifted, the returns vanished overnight, and now I am staring down a $30 million deficit." I watched him unravel, noting every single admission of guilt from my mental file. "You committed massive securities fraud," I stated, stripping away his pathetic justifications. "You stole from the very people drinking your champagne out there in the ballroom. And now you expect me to hand over the $5 million? Grandfather left me just so you can use it as a band-aid to cover your tracks." "It is not a band-aid," Richard snapped, marching back toward the desk and slapping his hand against the leather folder. "It is the missing piece. Trent and I have the offshore shell accounts set up in the Cayman Islands. Jamal already wired $2 million today. With your $5 million, we can execute a series of high-frequency trades through the Caribbean Correspondent Bank, wash the capital completely, and deposit it back into the firm's primary ledger before the auditors arrive on Thursday. We can make the massive deficit disappear. The firm survives, the family survives, but the transfer window closes at midnight. The offshore bank requires the beneficiary relinquishment form to be processed immediately to release the escrow hold. I need your signature right now." I looked at the gold pen resting on the desk. "You are asking me to become an accessory after the fact to federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and international money laundering. I am a sworn agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Dad. I took an oath to dismantle exactly this kind of criminal enterprise. I am not signing that document, and I am actively reporting you to my division chief the moment I walk out of this building." Richard stopped pacing. The frantic, desperate energy vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. He reached into his trousers pocket and slowly pulled out a small silver flash drive. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the light from the brass desk lamp. "I knew you would be stubborn," he said, his voice dropping back into a menacing, predatory tone. "You always were too righteous for your own good. But you are going to sign the form, Rebecca. Because if you do not, your pristine, perfect little career with the federal government ends tonight." I narrowed my eyes, analyzing the small silver device. "What is that?" "Insurance," Richard replied smoothly. He walked around the desk, leaning against the mahogany edge. "You act so tough, so untouchable. But I remember 5 years ago. I remember when your engagement fell apart. I remember you locking yourself in your apartment for months, entirely unable to function. You thought you kept it all so secret. You thought checking yourself into that private psychiatric clinic 2 towns over would keep your name off the family radar." A sudden icy chill spiked down my spine. The clinic. I had sought intensive therapy for severe clinical depression and anxiety after discovering my ex-fiancé's crippling gambling addiction and ending the relationship. It was the darkest period of my life, a profound struggle I had fought tooth and nail to overcome. Money opens a lot of highly secure doors. Rebecca Richard continued twisting the flash drive between his fingers. It turns out private clinic administrators are woefully underpaid. It cost me $20,000 to acquire your complete unredacted psychiatric evaluations. Every therapy session note, every medication dosage, every tearful admission of mental instability and suicidal ideation. It is all digitized right here on this drive. He stood up straight, his face twisted into a cruel, victorious sneer. You hold a high-level security clearance with the federal government. You handle sensitive financial data. What do you think your division chief will do when this drive magically appears on his desk tomorrow morning? What happens to your badge, your gun, and your precious career when the Bureau realizes their star forensic accountant has a documented history of severe mental instability that she failed to disclose during her background check? They will strip your clearance immediately. You will be fired, disgraced, and completely unemployable in the financial sector. You will lose everything you have built. I stared at the silver flash drive, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The sheer violation of my medical privacy was staggering. He had weaponized my deepest trauma, purchasing my pain to use as leverage for his own financial crimes. He was fully prepared to destroy my entire livelihood to save himself. My mind raced, calculating protocols, assessing damage control strategies, looking for the angle to disarm his blackmail. I kept my face rigid, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my internal panic. You would not dare, I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Distributing stolen medical records is a federal offense. You would be handing me the evidence to lock you away. I would not be the one sending it. Richard smiled viciously. It would be an anonymous leak. Untraceable. Just sign the form, Rebecca. Sign the paper, give Brittany the trust fund, and this flash drive goes straight into the fireplace. You go back to your life, and the family is saved. Before I could formulate my next countermeasure, a sharp metallic click echoed through the silent study. The heavy deadbolt on the oak door had been disengaged from the outside. The brass handle turned slowly and the door swung open. Caroline stepped into the room. My mother wore a wicked, triumphant smile that stretched from ear to ear. Her eyes gleamed with a toxic delight as she surveyed the scene, taking in my tense posture and Richard's aggressive stance. She closed the door behind her, leaning gracefully against the heavy oak wood, entirely unbothered by the criminal extortion taking place. Actually, Richard, Caroline said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness, I think you are being a little too generous with our ungrateful daughter. Richard looked at her, mildly confused. What do you mean? I have the drive right here. We have the leverage. Caroline let out a high musical laugh that made my blood run absolutely cold. Oh, darling, she purred, looking directly into my eyes. That is just the backup copy you are holding. You see, Rebecca, I knew you would be difficult tonight, so I took the liberty of removing the choice entirely. The original flash drive is not in your father's pocket. It is currently plugged directly into the master control laptop connected to the ballroom's central projector, and the slideshow is scheduled to begin in exactly 5 minutes. The air in the executive study seemed to instantly evaporate, leaving behind a cold, suffocating vacuum. Caroline stood perfectly poised by the heavy oak door, her champagne-colored gown rustling softly as she took a measured, predatory step forward. Her revelation hung in the space between us, a ticking time bomb designed to force my total surrender. 5 minutes until my deepest, most agonizing personal traumas were broadcasted on a 15-foot projection screen to a ballroom filled with 50 of the wealthiest, most judgmental socialites in Napa Valley. 5 minutes until my career as a federal forensic accountant was incinerated. Richard visibly relaxed, his shoulders dropping, as he let out a harsh bark of laughter. He looked at my mother with a mixture of profound relief and dark admiration. He stepped away from my personal space and leaned back against his mahogany desk, crossing his arms over his tailored tuxedo. He was more than happy to hand the executioner's axe over to his wife. Caroline closed the distance between us, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the Persian rug. She did not look frantic or desperate like my father. She looked serene. She wore the deeply disturbing, gentle mask of a mother who genuinely believed she was correcting a wayward, disobedient child. This was her specialty. She was a master architect of psychological warfare, and she was about to deploy every weapon in her arsenal to break my mind. You always were so incredibly dramatic. Rebecca. Caroline sighed, her voice dripping with manufactured pity. You stand there glaring at us, trying to make us out to be these terrible, ruthless villains. But you are the one forcing our hand. You are the one who has stubbornly refused to simply cooperate and be a functional part of this family. We are not extorting you, darling. We are simply collecting a long overdue debt. I kept my facial muscles perfectly still, refusing to give her even a micro-expression of weakness. A debt. I repeated, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding my veins. You are demanding $5 million from a legal trust fund to cover up your husband's massive federal embezzlement scheme, and you are calling it a debt. Caroline reached out and gently smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on my shoulder, a physical violation disguised as maternal affection. I stepped back, instantly breaking her touch. Yes, a debt, she continued, completely unfazed by my rejection. Do you have any earthly idea what it has cost us to raise you, Rebecca? I do not just mean the private schools and the expensive clothes you never appreciated. I mean the sheer excruciating social toll of having you as a daughter. You have been a walking embarrassment to this family for your entire adult life. She began to pace slowly around me, circling her prey. When you canceled your wedding 5 years ago, do you know how humiliating that was for me? I had to face my friends at the country club and explain why my oldest daughter was suddenly single, unstable, and checking herself into a psychiatric facility. We had to endure the whispers and the pitying looks. And then, instead of recovering gracefully and marrying into a respectable family, you took a boring, aggressive government job. You actively chose to isolate yourself. You actively chose to be a burden on our reputation. We paid the price for your miserable, selfish behavior for years. This $5 million is not extortion. It is your restitution. It is the absolute least you can do to repay us for the stain you put on the family name. The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was attempting to reframe an international wire fraud and blackmail conspiracy as a righteous family tax. She actually believed her own twisted logic. She truly believed that my battle with severe clinical depression was nothing more than a personal insult directed at her social calendar. You cannot honestly believe this, I stated, staring at her perfectly contoured face. You are facing decades in a federal penitentiary for moving stolen client funds through offshore Cayman accounts. But you are standing here trying to convince me that I owe you this money because my canceled wedding embarrassed you at the country club. We are not going to any penitentiary. Caroline snapped, her gentle, motherly facade finally cracking to reveal the raw, naked greed underneath. Her voice rose, echoing sharply off the wood-paneled walls. Because you are going to sign that paper. You are going to do exactly what you are told for once in your miserable life. You need to sacrifice yourself for the greater good of this family. She gestured wildly toward the locked door, pointing toward the ballroom where the party was carrying on without us. You need to look at the bigger picture, Rebecca. Look at Brittany. Look at Trent. They have actual vision. They understand how the world works. They are the future of this family's wealth. Jamal's $2 million is just the seed money. Trent is a brilliant financial strategist. With your $5 million, they can secure the offshore accounts. Richard's brokerage firm is saved, and we will ascend to a level of wealth and power you cannot even comprehend. Brittany is building a legacy, and you are nothing but a roadblock. It is time for you to step aside and let the people who actually matter take control. Richard nodded eagerly from the desk. Your mother is entirely right. Brittany and Trent are doing what it takes to elevate this family. You are just a cynical, bitter woman trying to drag everyone down to your level. You have 2 minutes until that slideshow starts, Rebecca. 2 minutes until your entire professional and personal life is projected onto a 15-foot screen. Caroline stepped right up to me, her eyes manic and wide. She tapped her manicured fingernail hard against the beneficiary relinquishment form resting on the desk. Sign the paper. Give your sister the trust fund. Do something useful for this family for the very first time in your life. The digital clock on Richard's desk flipped forward. 1 minute and 45 seconds remained. The silence in the room returned heavy and suffocating. They both stared at me, their chests heaving with anticipation. They had played their ultimate trump card. They had cornered me with my darkest secret, weaponized my trauma, and demanded a $5 million ransom. They were absolutely certain they had broken my spirit. I looked down at the fraudulent legal document. I looked at the gold Mont Blanc pen resting beside it. I reached out with a steady hand. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the pen. Caroline let out a sharp, victorious breath. A wicked, deeply satisfied smirk spread across her face. She looked at Richard and they exchanged a triumphant glance. They had won. The golden child was going to get her millions, the federal auditors would be fooled, and the black sheep of the family had finally surrendered. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I held it over the dotted line at the bottom of the page. I let the nib hover just a millimeter above the expensive paper. Then, moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness, I pulled the cap off the back of the pen. I placed the cap firmly over the writing nib, sealing it with a soft click. I dropped the capped pen onto the center of the mahogany desk. It rolled away, clattering against the base of the lamp. I rolled my shoulders back, straightening my posture to my full height. The defeated, cornered daughter vanished entirely. The federal forensic investigator stepped forward to take her place. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked Caroline and Richard dead in the eye, my expression carved from solid ice. "Did you honestly believe?" I began, my voice carrying the resonant, unyielding acoustics of a federal courtroom, that handing me a stolen medical file would magically compel me to finance an international money laundering operation. Caroline blinked rapidly, her smug smile faltering as if the ambient temperature in the room had just plummeted below zero. She glanced at the capped pen resting against the brass lamp, then back at my face, entirely failing to comprehend my lack of submission. Richard scoffed loudly, trying to maintain his aggressive, dominant posture. "You are bluffing, Rebecca. You care about your precious federal badge way too much to let us ruin you. You will sign the paper." "I care about the law," I corrected him smoothly, stepping around the mahogany desk so there was absolutely no physical barrier remaining between us. "So let us conduct a quick legal review, Dad. Right now, you are attempting to violate Title 18 United States Code Section 873, blackmail, by threatening to publish unlawfully acquired, highly sensitive psychiatric evaluations unless I surrender a $5 million asset. You have officially crossed the threshold from a desperate failing broker to a federal extortionist. The statutory maximum penalty for that specific offense is up to 1 year in prison. But as you know, that is merely the appetizer." I took another slow, deliberate step forward, locking eyes with my mother. She instinctively took a half step backward, her expensive gown brushing against the leather sofa. I was employing a classic tactical maneuver I utilized during high-stakes suspect interviews, claiming the physical space in the room to assert absolute psychological dominance over the targets. Then we have the unauthorized acquisition of those medical records. I continued, my tone relentless, perfectly measured, and devoid of any emotional vulnerability. "You just admitted out loud to bribing a clinic administrator. That is a direct, undeniable violation of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, coupled with multiple federal bribery statutes. But the absolute crown jewel of your evening is the underlying financial motive. You are attempting to coerce these funds to mask a $30 million insolvency and facilitate an offshore wire transfer to a Cayman Islands shell company. That brings us to Title 18, Section 1343, wire fraud. Each transaction carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison." Richard's face drained of its furious red color, settling into a sickly, grayish pallor. He gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white as he braced himself against the devastating weight of his own criminal reality. Add it all together. I stated, letting the silence emphasize my words to maximum effect. "And you are both looking at decades behind bars. Furthermore, even if I did pick up that gold pen and sign the beneficiary relinquishment form right now, any contract executed under documented duress and blackmail is instantaneously null and void in a court of equity. Your entire master plan is legally, financially, and logically illiterate. You are my daughter, Caroline shrieked, her voice cracking unpleasantly as the reality of my clinical breakdown finally pierced her thick armor of delusions. You would not dare send your own parents to a federal penitentiary. You ceased being my parents the very moment you decided my mental health was a commodity you could purchase to fund Britney's fake empire. I replied, not breaking eye contact for a single microsecond. You placed a price tag on my suffering. Now you get to pay the bill. That was the exact moment Richard snapped. The calculated, sophisticated businessman persona shattered completely into a million jagged pieces, leaving behind a frantic, vicious, and deeply pathetic man who had just watched his final lifeboat sink to the bottom of the ocean. He slammed both of his fists down onto the leather portfolio, his chest heaving as he unleashed a torrent of pure, unadulterated venom. You worthless, ungrateful parasite! Richard roared, the sheer volume of his voice vibrating against the heavy wood-paneled walls of the executive study. Spittle flew from his lips as he marched toward me, stopping only when he realized I was not going to retreat a single inch. We gave you everything in this life. We put a solid roof over your head. We gave you a respectable, wealthy name. And this is exactly how you repay us, by quoting federal statutes in my own house. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my forehead. You think you have won because you know the law. You think your little government badge protects you from absolute public humiliation. You are wrong, Rebecca. You are entirely wrong. I am going to destroy you tonight. I am going to walk out there, stand on that stage, and tell 50 of the most powerful people in this state exactly how unstable and pathetic you really are. Caroline nodded enthusiastically beside him, her eyes wild with a sudden burst of malice. He will do it, Rebecca. We will ruin your reputation so thoroughly that you will never be able to show your face in civilized society again. We will make absolutely certain everyone knows you are a broken, bitter woman who is actively trying to tear her successful sister down out of pure, uncontrollable jealousy. I am going to put your psychiatric notes up on that 15-foot screen. Richard screamed, his face contorting with absolute hatred, his breathing ragged. I am going to read them out loud over the microphone. I will describe every miserable, pathetic detail of your canceled wedding and your clinical depression. I will make them laugh at you. I will make them pity you. By the time I am finished, you will be begging me to let you sign that paper, just to make the humiliation stop. He practically panted, waiting for my armor to finally crack. He expected tears. He expected me to fall to my knees and plead for mercy. He firmly believed that public shame was the ultimate undefeatable weapon, because in his shallow status-obsessed world, public perception was the only currency that actually mattered. He had absolutely no idea that I had stopped caring about the opinions of his country club friends half a decade ago. I looked at my father, feeling a profound, absolute sense of nothingness. There was no sadness left. There was no anger. There was only the clinical detachment of a federal agent observing a criminal suspect sealing his own spectacular demise. I turned my back on both of them. I walked calmly and purposefully toward the heavy oak door. Where do you think you are going? Richard yelled, taking a heavy step toward me. I said you are not leaving this room. I reached out and grasped the brass deadbolt. With a sharp, resounding click, I unlocked the door. I wrapped my hand around the handle and pulled the heavy door wide open. The sudden influx of classical music, clinking glassware, and ambient chatter from the adjacent ballroom washed over us, breaking the suffocating isolation of the study. I stood in the doorway, perfectly illuminated by the warm golden light spilling in from the hallway. I looked back over my shoulder at my parents. They stood frozen near the mahogany desk, completely bewildered by my total lack of fear. I raised my arm and gestured openly toward the glittering ballroom, offering them the stage they so desperately wanted. Go ahead and give your speech, Dad. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I left the heavy oak door wide open behind me, stepping out of the stifling executive study and back into the vibrant, echoing space of the main ballroom. My posture remained immaculate. I smoothed the skirt of my Armani dress, taking a slow, steadying breath to regulate my heart rate. The air out here smelled of expensive catered food and fresh floral arrangements, a sharp contrast to the aged bourbon and desperate fear I had just left behind. I walked with deliberate confidence, knowing my parents were watching my back from the threshold of the study, scrambling to figure out if I was actually calling their bluff. I navigated through the clusters of wealthy socialites, making my way back to the table where Jamal was seated. Jamal was not mingling with the other guests. He sat rigidly in a gilded dining chair, staring intensely at the crystal water glass in front of him. The revelation about Trent's watch had deeply rattled him, stripping away the relaxed, joyful demeanor he had carried all evening. As I pulled out the chair next to him and sat down, his head snapped toward me. His eyes were wide, calculating, and filled with a dark, brewing storm. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was made of thin glass. "Where did Richard take you?" Jamal asked, his voice low and urgent, completely ignoring the usual social pleasantries. "I saw him grab your arm." Brittany ran off to the powder room the second I asked her about the jeweler. Trent disappeared entirely. "What is going on here, Rebecca?" I turned to look at my brother-in-law. He was a good man, an intelligent professional who had been manipulated by the people he loved most because he wanted to believe in them. I needed to give him the absolute truth before the illusion shattered completely. "Richard and Caroline just attempted to extort me for $5 million in a locked room," I replied, keeping my volume strictly contained to our private space. "They needed my signature to release a trust fund so they could route it offshore. Tonight is not an anniversary party, Jamal. It is a smokescreen." Jamal inhaled sharply, his broad shoulders tensing under his tuxedo jacket. Before he could demand further explanation, the delicate chiming of a spoon tapping against a crystal glass rang out through the ballroom. The waitstaff swiftly moved through the room, directing the 50 elite guests to take their assigned seats at the lavishly decorated round tables. The low hum of conversation faded into an expectant silence. The main chandeliers dimmed, casting the perimeter of the room in shadow, while a bright, focused spotlight illuminated the small stage set up at the front. Richard strode up the side steps and took his place behind the lucite podium. He had physically recovered from his frantic meltdown in the study. His tie was perfectly straight, his hair smoothed back into place, and he wore that signature magnetic smile that had conned dozens of investors out of their life savings. Only someone trained to spot deception could see the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the edges of the podium, or the heavy beads of sweat catching the harsh spotlight on his forehead. "Good evening, esteemed friends, honored guests, and beloved family." Richard began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. He sounded absolutely masterful, pouring on the artificial warmth. "Caroline and I are profoundly moved to see so many familiar faces here tonight. 35 years of marriage is a remarkable milestone. But as we reflect on our lives, we realize that our greatest achievement is not our endurance as a couple. It is the legacy we are building for the future." Caroline slipped into an empty seat at the front table, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She played the part of the emotional, proud matriarch to perfection, nodding along with every word her husband spoke. "Wealth is not just about numbers on a balance sheet." Richard continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, deliberately avoiding the table where Jamal and I sat. "True wealth is about vision. It is about passing the torch to the next generation of innovators and leaders. And tonight we want to formally recognize the future of this family's legacy." Richard extended his hand gracefully toward the front row. "My youngest daughter, Brittany, has always possessed a brilliant entrepreneurial spirit. She is a visionary, and alongside her, our trusted business partner, Trent, has proven himself to be a financial strategist of the highest caliber. Together, they are launching a wellness empire that will revolutionize the industry. They embody the hard work, the integrity, and the absolute dedication that this family stands for." Polite applause rippled through the audience, Brittany stood up briefly, waving to the crowd, with a practiced, modest smile. Trent stood next to her, giving a slight bow, his tuxedo sleeve carefully pulled down to hide the stolen Patek Philippe watch. They looked like the ultimate power team, basking in the fraudulent praise of a desperate man. "We are investing heavily in their future," Richard declared, his voice rising with theatrical passion. "Because family supports family. We recognize greatness, and we back it with everything we have. Trent and Brittany are showing us all what it means to build a successful, unified empire." As the applause swelled again, I felt a sudden sharp movement beside me. Jamal was not clapping. He was hunched over his elbows, resting heavily on his knees, holding his smartphone below the level of the table. The screen illuminated his face in the dim lighting, casting harsh shadows across his features. His expression had shifted from suspicious to something entirely different. It was pure, unadulterated shock, rapidly hardening into a terrifying, icy rage. I leaned closer to him, keeping my eyes on the stage where Richard was preparing to transition to the next phase of his speech. "Jamal," I whispered cautiously, "what is it?" Jamal did not look up from his screen. His thumb hovered over the banking application open on his phone, trembling slightly as he refreshed the page. When he spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of all its former warmth. "I hold the primary authorization key for my family's Atlanta trust." Jamal whispered back his words, clipping together with mechanical precision. "I told Trent I was going to authorize the $2 million wire transfer tomorrow morning after I reviewed the final escrow documents. I never sent the approval code." He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes burning with a devastating realization. The betrayal had finally eclipsed his denial. "Rebecca, the money is gone," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. "The $2 million was wired out of the account 30 minutes ago. Brittany bypassed my two-factor authentication on my personal laptop. She initiated the transfer to Trent's offshore account herself. The $2 million was wired out of the account 30 minutes ago. Brittany bypassed my authentication on my personal laptop. She initiated the transfer to Trent's offshore account herself." I placed my hand over Jamal's fingers, pressing his phone against the tablecloth. The magnitude of his wife's betrayal vibrated through him, threatening to explode there in the ballroom. I leaned close to his jacket. "Do not speak, Jamal," I instructed beneath the swelling applause for my father. "Do not stand up. Take a screenshot of that transfer right now and forward it to your legal counsel. Lock every account you possess. Let them think they have won. We need them to stay on that stage and complete their performance. The higher they climb, the harder they fall." Jamal swallowed heavily, his jaw muscles working as he stared at the stage where his wife was blowing kisses to the audience. He nodded, his expression hardening into a mask of absolute resolve. He slipped his phone under the table, his thumbs flying across the screen to secure his family's wealth. On the stage, the heavy velvet curtains parted to reveal a massive state-of-the-art projection screen, dropping down behind the lucite podium. Richard clicked a small wireless remote in his hand, and the ballroom lights dimmed even further. A bright cinematic video montage began to play, the screen filled with high-definition, aggressively edited photographs of Brittany. There she was, standing in front of an office building that I knew was merely a rented co-working space. The next slide showed her holding a sleek, minimalist bottle of her supposed organic skincare serum, flashing a brilliant manufactured smile. "Brittany represents the pinnacle of the modern entrepreneur," Richard declared into the microphone. "She took a simple vision of wellness and transformed it into a highly lucrative startup. Aura Wellness has secured international distribution lines, premium raw materials, and the market share that veteran executives only dream about. She is a relentless force of nature, doing it all while maintaining the most perfect marriage a father could ever witness." The screen shifted to a professional, retouched engagement photo of Brittany and Jamal. They were laughing on a sailboat, looking like the ultimate picture of young, affluent bliss. Beside me, Jamal let out a slow, steady breath through his nose. He was staring at the projection of his own face, realizing that his entire marriage had been nothing but an orchestrated prop for my father's schemes. Richard continued his sermon, pacing across the stage to ensure every guest felt the emotional weight of his performance. He pointed toward Trent, who was leaning against the edge of the stage with a victorious grin. We cannot celebrate Brittany without acknowledging her brilliant corporate strategist. Trent. Richard beamed. Trent has been the financial architect behind this lucrative expansion. He has navigated international markets to ensure this family's investments are multiplied. Together, Trent and Brittany have built an unbreakable foundation. Absolute success is the only possible outcome. The wealthy guests clapped enthusiastically. Several people at the surrounding tables raised their champagne glasses in a toast to Brittany, who graciously bowed her head in fake humility. Caroline clapped the loudest from the front row, looking back to ensure everyone was worshiping her golden child. But then the upbeat, triumphant instrumental music playing softly in the background abruptly cut out. The transition was so sudden and jarring that several guests visibly jumped in their seats. A low, somber cello melody began to play, filling the cavernous ballroom with a heavy, melancholic atmosphere. The lighting shifted from warm gold to a stark, clinical white. Richard stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still behind the lucite podium, his shoulders slumping in a practiced display of unbearable grief. He looked down at the floor, letting a heavy silence stretch across the room for 10 agonizing seconds. The giant projection screen behind him flickered. The glamorous, high-resolution images of Brittany vanished entirely. In their place, a highly unflattering, grainy photograph appeared. It was a picture of me. It had been taken secretly years ago. I was standing outside my old apartment building in the pouring rain. I wore baggy sweatpants and an oversized hoodie. My hair was tangled. I was staring at the ground, pale, exhausted, and completely devoid of life. It was a candid shot, taken during the lowest point of my depression, days after my engagement fell apart. The stark contrast between Brittany's curated perfection and my raw misery was meant to elicit immediate disgust and pity. A collective gasp rippled through the 50 VIP guests. The murmurs started instantly. People leaned in to whisper to their table mates, casting quick, uncomfortable glances in my direction. I sat perfectly still, my expression a mask of solid stone. I did not avert my eyes from the screen. I let them look at me. I let them see the pain my family weaponized for this exact moment. Richard let out a long, theatrical sigh into the microphone. He looked out at the audience, his eyes shining with fake, unshed tears. "We all strive for perfection," Richard said in a patronizing whisper that commanded the attention of every person in the room. "We build our empires, we celebrate our victories, we showcase our brightest stars like Brittany and Trent. But what we rarely discuss in these elegant halls is the burden that success carries. We rarely talk about the shadows that linger behind the spotlight. We rarely talk about the weight of watching your own blood refuse to rise." He paused, letting his gaze drift across the room until it locked directly onto me. The spotlight hit my face, illuminating me for the crowd to judge. "Tonight is not just about celebrating the pinnacle of success," Richard announced, his voice dripping with performative sorrow. "Tonight, we must also confront the very uncomfortable and ugly truth of our own failures. We must deal with the heartbreaking reality of dealing with the pain of a failing child." The silence in the ballroom transformed from an expectant hush into a suffocating, uncomfortable vacuum. Richard gripped the edges of the lucite podium, leaning into the microphone, so his deep, booming voice resonated through the chests of every single person seated at the banquet tables. He clicked the wireless remote again. The projection screen behind him flashed, swapping the grainy, miserable photo of me in the rain for a scanned, enlarged image of a university transcript. A bright red circle highlighted my change of major from pre-law to general accounting. It is the most excruciating experience a parent can endure. Richard continued shaking his head with a perfectly rehearsed display of paternal disappointment. You give a child every possible advantage. You pay for the finest private schools. You secure them a spot in a prestigious legal program. You hand them the keys to a kingdom of wealth and opportunity. And then you watch them throw it all away because they simply lack the fundamental drive to succeed. Rebecca had the world at her fingertips. She could have joined the family firm. She could have been a partner. Instead, she chose the path of least resistance. She dropped out of her elite legal studies to take a low-level, uninspired government accounting job. She chose mediocrity. A collective murmur rippled through the sea of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. Wealthy socialites leaned across their tables, whispering behind crystal wine glasses. To this crowd, abandoning a high-status career path for a civil service job was the ultimate social sin. Richard knew his audience intimately. He knew exactly which buttons to push to strip away my credibility and reduce me to a cautionary tale. He was systematically dismantling my character, painting me as a lazy, unambitious failure who had squandered the family's generous investments. But professional mediocrity was merely the beginning of her tragic downward spiral. Richard proclaimed, his voice dropping an octave to convey a sickening sense of intimacy. He clicked the remote once more. A new image filled the massive screen. It was a photograph of an elegant silver-embossed wedding invitation. My wedding invitation from 5 years ago. The date was crossed out with a harsh, jagged black line. "We all desire happiness for our children," Richard said, his tone softening into a grotesque parody of heartbreak. "We want to see them walk down the aisle. We want to welcome wonderful sons into our family, just as we welcomed the brilliant Jamal." But Rebecca could not even manage that basic human milestone. Weeks before she was scheduled to take her vows, her relationship violently imploded. And it did not end because of some tragic, unavoidable circumstance. It ended because Rebecca is fundamentally incapable of sharing her life. She drove a good, decent man away with her relentless paranoia, her suffocating isolation, and her profound mental instability. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. The cruelty of exposing a cancelled wedding at a celebratory gala was shocking even for the ruthless standards of Napa Valley high society. At the table beside me, Jamal sat frozen in absolute outrage. His hands were curled into tight fists on the white tablecloth, his knuckles practically glowing white under the dim lights. But my focus shifted to his parents. Dr. Calvin and Professor Beatrice were seated 2 tables away, positioned near the front of the stage. They were the epitome of refined old-money grace, and their faces currently registered pure, unadulterated disgust. Dr. Calvin slowly shook his head, his brow furrowed in revulsion. Professor Beatrice placed her napkin deliberately on the table, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. They were highly educated, dignified people who understood that publicly humiliating your own flesh and blood for entertainment was the ultimate sign of a vulgar, classless family. Richard was attempting to destroy my reputation, but he was simultaneously exposing his own absolute lack of morality to the very investors he was trying to impress. In the front row, Caroline flawlessly executed her supporting role. She pressed a delicate lace handkerchief to her eyes, letting out a soft, audible sob that the microphone picked up perfectly. She leaned against Brittany, who wrapped a comforting arm around her mother's shoulders. Brittany stared up at the stage, a smug, victorious sneer playing at the corners of her mouth. She was entirely thriving on my public execution. Caroline wiped away her fake tears and looked out at the audience, shaking her head, as if the burden of loving me was simply too heavy to bear. "We tried everything," Caroline whispered loudly enough for the front tables to hear. "We gave her everything, and she just threw it back in our faces." Richard nodded solemnly at his wife, confirming her fabricated narrative. "That is the devastating truth," he announced, gripping the microphone tightly. "A family is a unit. We build together, we sacrifice together, and we protect our legacy together. But Rebecca is a selfish, isolated individual who refuses to contribute to the greater good. While Brittany and Trent are working tirelessly to build an empire that will sustain this family for generations." Rebecca sits alone in her miserable apartment hoarding her resources. She actively refuses to help her own flesh and blood. When this family needed her support to secure the future of our financial enterprises, she turned her back on us. She is a parasite who drains the joy and the vitality from this family, offering absolutely nothing in return. The sheer hypocrisy of his words echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He was standing on a stage having just orchestrated the theft of $2 million from his son-in-law, calling me a parasite because I refused to fund his federal wire fraud with my grandfather's trust fund. He was weaving a masterful illusion, casting himself as the exhausted noble patriarch and me as the villainous greedy daughter. He was preparing the crowd for the grand finale, the moment he would demand I surrender my inheritance as penance for my supposed sins. Richard raised his hand, signaling the technical crew at the back of the ballroom. Suddenly, the ambient lighting in the entire room was completely extinguished. The ballroom plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Guests gasped in surprise. The low murmuring ceased instantly, replaced by a tense electric anticipation. The only illumination came from the glowing exit signs and the faint digital light of the massive projection screen. Then a blinding high-intensity theatrical spotlight snapped on. The beam of pure white light sliced through the darkness like a physical blade. It swept rapidly across the elegant banquet tables, illuminating terrified faces and sparkling crystal glasses for a fraction of a second before moving on. The spotlight tracked relentlessly toward the back of the room, hunting its target. The blinding beam stopped abruptly. It locked directly onto me. I was instantly bathed in a harsh, inescapable glare. The light was so bright it temporarily blinded my peripheral vision, isolating me completely from Jamal and the surrounding guests. I was trapped in the center of a glowing circle, completely exposed to the staring eyes of 50 elite socialites hidden in the dark. On the stage, Richard stepped out from behind the lucite podium. He walked to the very edge of the platform, bathed in the secondary glow of the projector. He raised his right arm slowly and pointed his index finger directly at me through the suffocating darkness of the ballroom. He pointed his index finger directly at me through the suffocating darkness of the ballroom. The blinding white spotlight pinned me to my chair, exposing me to the collective gaze of 50 elite socialites. My father lowered his microphone slightly, letting the theatrical silence stretch until the tension became almost unbearable. He wanted the weight of public scrutiny to crush my spine and force me into submission. Rebecca Richard commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Stand up." I did not move. I remained perfectly seated, my hands resting lightly on the white tablecloth, my expression devoid of the terror he so desperately sought. Uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the darkness surrounding me. People held their breath, waiting for the disgraced daughter to shatter. "For years, this family has carried the burden of your failures." Richard continued, his tone shifting to righteous indignation. "We shielded you. We funded your mistakes. We smiled through the embarrassment of your canceled wedding and erratic career choices. But tonight, the shielding ends. Tonight is about accountability. It is about recognizing who builds the legacy of this family and who actively attempts to tear it down." I shifted my gaze toward the front row. Even through the harsh glare, I could see Brittany. She sat, vibrating with triumphant glee. She leaned her head affectionately against Trent's shoulder, her hand resting intimately on his thigh, abandoning all pretense of professionalism. Trent wrapped his arm around the back of her chair, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. They believed they had orchestrated the perfect public execution. They were so entirely focused on my humiliation that neither noticed the man sitting at my table. Jamal was glaring at them, his eyes burning with silent, catastrophic fury. He gripped his smartphone so tightly his knuckles were stark white, the digital proof of Brittany's $2 million theft burning a hole in his palm. He saw his wife leaning on another man. He saw the brazen disrespect. He was a ticking time bomb, and Richard was oblivious to the detonation he just triggered. "You have been a parasite on this family's goodwill," Richard announced, taking a step closer to the edge of the stage. while your sister Brittany worked tirelessly to build an empire while she dedicated her life to elevating our name alongside her brilliant husband Jamal and our trusted partner Trent, you hoarded resources. You sit on a $5 million trust fund established by your grandfather, a fund meant for the advancement of this family, and you contribute absolutely nothing to our collective success. The crowd let out a synchronized gasp. Discussing specific financial figures in public was considered gauche among the Napa Valley elite, but Richard was beyond caring about etiquette. He was a cornered animal playing his desperate card. He needed that money to save himself from federal prison, and he was willing to burn his own daughter at the stake to get it. True redemption requires sacrifice, Richard boomed into the microphone, his voice dripping with venomous authority. It requires acknowledging your betters. So tonight, Rebecca, I am giving you a choice. I am giving you a chance to finally do something honorable. I demand that you stand up right now. I demand that you look your sister in the eye and apologize to her for being a burden. Apologize for your jealousy. Apologize for your embarrassing, pathetic life. My mother Caroline stood up from her seat in the front row, turning to face me. She clasped her hands together over her chest, playing the desperate matriarch. Please, Rebecca. Caroline called out, her voice loud enough to carry through the quiet ballroom. Just do the right thing. Apologize to Brittany. Heal this family. And once you apologize, Richard demanded, raising his voice to cut over Caroline's theatrics, you will announce to this entire room that you are stepping aside. You will publicly declare that you are relinquishing your rights to the Harrington Trust Fund. You will transfer that $5 million to Brittany, the daughter who actually deserves it. You will sign the paperwork tonight, and you will finally make yourself useful to the legacy you have spent your life tarnishing. The audacity of the demand hung heavy in the air. He was ordering me to publicly forfeit my inheritance and beg for forgiveness from a woman currently committing federal wire fraud. He thought the terror of public humiliation would override my logic. He believed that exposing my past mental health struggles and embarrassing me in front of wealthy investors would render me broken. I looked at Trent, who gave me an arrogant wink. I looked at Brittany, who flipped her hair over her shoulder, waiting for me to grovel. I looked at Caroline, who wore a vicious sneer beneath her mask of maternal concern. Finally, I looked up at Richard, who stood on the stage like a conquering dictator, anticipating my absolute surrender. I took a deep, measured breath. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed my chair back. The scrape of the wooden legs against the hardwood floor sounded incredibly loud in the silent room. I stood up. I did not burst into tears. I did not drop my head in shame. I did not turn around and run toward the heavy double doors. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, my spine made of absolute steel. I smoothed the front of my custom Armani gown, ensuring not a single wrinkle betrayed my movement. I stepped out from behind my table and walked directly into the center of the blinding white spotlight. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I walked with the precise, intimidating cadence of a federal forensic investigator entering a hostile environment. Every strike of my heels against the polished floor echoed like a gunshot. The 50 VIP guests parted slightly, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and morbid fascination. Jamal watched me go, his eyes locking onto mine for a brief second. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, a silent confirmation that he was ready for the destruction I was about to unleash. I reached the front of the ballroom. Brittany's smug smile faltered slightly as I completely ignored her, stepping right past her chair without a single glance in her direction. Caroline shrank back, unnerved by my lack of fear. I reached the bottom of the stage steps. I placed my hand on the brass railing and ascended the stairs with fluid, unwavering confidence. I stepped onto the platform, walking directly toward my father. Richard's triumphant expression vanished, replaced by a sudden, creeping panic. He had expected a broken, sobbing victim speaking from the floor. He never anticipated that I would invade his stage. I stopped just inches away from him, completely invading his personal space, and stared dead into his terrified eyes. I reached out my hand and stepped right up to the lucite podium. I wrapped my fingers firmly around the sleek metal casing of the microphone. Richard was so entirely paralyzed by my blatant defiance that his grip was slack, his fingers unresisting. I slid the device effortlessly from his sweating hand. He stood there on the elevated platform, his mouth slightly ajar, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. The powerful, commanding patriarch, who had just spent the last 10 minutes aggressively assassinating my character in front of the Valley elite, had completely vanished. He was nothing more than an aging, desperate fraud, staring at the one person in his life he could no longer manipulate or control. I stepped perfectly into the center of the blinding white spotlight, taking his exact position behind the clear lucite podium. I did not tap the microphone to test the audio. I did not ask for the room's attention. I already possessed every single ounce of it. The silence in the cavernous ballroom was absolute and suffocating. 50 high-net-worth individuals, prominent socialites, and corporate executives were holding their collective breath, sitting rigidly at their banquet tables, waiting to see if the disgraced, supposedly unstable daughter was about to beg for forgiveness or completely unravel under the pressure. Instead of speaking, I unclasped the geometric gold latch of my evening clutch. I reached inside and retrieved my smartphone. The high-definition screen illuminated my face in the pitch-black room, casting a pale bluish glow against the stark white of the theatrical spotlight. My thumbs moved with practiced surgical precision across the smooth glass surface. I navigated past my email application, bypassing the encrypted federal communication channels I used for active investigations, and opened the device's main system settings. Earlier in the evening, while my mother was busy insulting my Armani gown in the grand foyer, I had casually noted the brand and model of the high-end audio-visual equipment powering the ballroom's sound system. It was a standard commercial Bose setup, the exact same sophisticated system we utilized in our agency conference rooms for forensic audio analysis and suspect interrogations. I scanned the available Bluetooth networks populating on my screen. I found the master receiver, instantly its default broadcast name, completely unsecured by the venue staff. I tapped the connect button. A sharp electronic chime resonated through the massive speakers mounted in all four corners of the vaulted ceiling, confirming the successful pairing. The sound was loud enough to make several guests in the front row physically flinch. Caroline let out a small, confused gasp, clutching her diamond necklace. Down at the front table, Brittany finally stopped smirking. She sat up completely straight, her eyes darting nervously between the phone in my hand and the ceiling speakers above her head. The smug, untouchable confidence she had worn all evening was beginning to fracture, rapidly replaced by a creeping, instinctive dread. On the stage, the sudden electronic chime snapped Richard out of his temporary paralysis. The realization of what was happening hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He did not know exactly what file I was planning to play through those speakers, but the primal, guilty panic of a cornered criminal overrode his shock. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson, the blood vessels in his neck bulging against his starched collar. "What do you think you are doing?" Richard hissed, stepping aggressively into my personal space. The live microphone caught the harsh, venomous whisper, broadcasting his panic faintly to the front tables. He lunged forward, his large hands snapping out to snatch the microphone back from my grip. His manicured fingernails grazed the back of my knuckles. He intended to physically overpower me right there on the stage, to forcefully rip the audio equipment away and frantically signal the technical crew to cut the master power. He wanted to drag me off the platform and silence me before I could detonate whatever digital bomb I was holding in my hand. But before his fingers could completely close around the metal mesh of the microphone, a violent, explosive sound shattered the tension in the room. It was the harsh, grating screech of a heavy wooden dining chair being shoved violently backward across the polished hardwood floor. Everyone in the dark ballroom turned their heads simultaneously. Jamal stood up. My brother-in-law rose from his seat at our banquet table like a rising monolith. Jamal was a former collegiate athlete who had maintained his formidable, commanding build throughout his demanding career as a high-powered investment banker. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his broad shoulders stretching the seams of his tailored navy tuxedo. He did not say a single word. He did not need to. The sheer overwhelming physical presence of the African American executive commanded the absolute attention of the entire room. Jamal took one slow, deliberate step away from his table, positioning himself directly in the aisle between the stage and his wife. His dark eyes were fixed squarely on Richard with an intensity that could melt solid steel. The polite, respectful son-in-law from a prominent Atlanta family was gone. The sophisticated, accommodating financial backer was completely dead. In his place stood a furious, powerful man who had just realized his entire marriage was a calculated financial heist, and he was daring the architect of that heist to make one more wrong move. Jamal did not raise his voice to shout. He simply stared up at the stage, his jaw locked tight, his large hands curling into massive fists at his sides. The message radiating from his rigid, athletic posture was unmistakable to everyone watching. If Richard laid a single hand on me, Jamal was going to step onto that platform and physically dismantle him in front of 50 horrified witnesses. Richard froze instantly. His hand hovered in midair mere inches from the microphone. He looked down at Jamal, the angry color rapidly draining from his flushed face, leaving him a sickly pale white. The predatory courage he possessed when bullying his daughter evaporated completely when faced with a man who could effortlessly break him in half. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his bow tie. He slowly lowered his arm, stepping backward away from the podium, completely neutralized and deeply intimidated by Jamal's imposing silent threat. I gave Jamal a brief appreciative nod from the stage. He had secured the perimeter. He had ensured my safety. The stage was now entirely mine, and there was no one left who could stop the execution. I turned my attention back to the captive audience. I looked down at the front row, locking eyes with Brittany, who was now visibly trembling in her seat, pressing herself closer to Trent for physical protection. I looked at Trent, whose arrogant grin had been replaced by a sickening, sweaty panic as he realized his offshore theft was about to be exposed. I looked at Caroline, who was gripping the edge of her table with white knuckles, her fake theatrical tears completely forgotten. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the dark ballroom, perfectly calm, carrying the absolute uncompromising authority of the undeniable truth. "Dad," I announced, ensuring every single syllable was crisp and clear for the elite audience. "You forgot to list Brittany's two greatest achievements: federal wire fraud and infidelity. Let's listen." I looked down at my illuminated smartphone screen, pressed my thumb firmly against the glass, and hit play. The high-definition digital audio file engaged instantly. There was a fraction of a second of absolute dead silence, a microscopic digital breath, before the state-of-the-art Bose speakers mounted in the vaulted ceiling crackled to life. The acoustics in the grand ballroom were flawless, initially designed to amplify classical quartets and operatic singers. Tonight, they were broadcasting a crystal-clear, high-fidelity recording of federal crimes directly into the ears of 50 elite victims. I had not just walked into this country club relying on luck and intuition. As a forensic accountant for the federal government, I had access to sophisticated, legally permissible digital surveillance tools when investigating suspected offshore money laundering linked to domestic accounts. When I first noticed the glaring anomalies in my father's brokerage firm ledgers months ago, I initiated a quiet internal audit. When the digital trail led directly to Brittany's mobile devices and Trent's encrypted corporate tablets, I deployed an advanced forensic spyware packet masked as a routine calendar update. It had silently recorded their private strategy meetings, capturing every single hushed conversation, every arrogant confession, and every single illegal scheme they discussed behind closed doors. A sharp, familiar voice sliced through the heavy darkness of the ballroom. It was Brittany. Her tone was not the sweet, modest pitch she had used when waving to the audience just 10 minutes ago. It was harsh, grating, and dripping with malicious boredom. "Trent, just tolerate Jamal for one more week until the $2 million clears into our Cayman account. Then I will file for divorce and leave him with the tax evasion charges." The sound of Brittany's voice echoing from above caused a synchronized violent flinch across the front tables. Down in the front row, the real Brittany physically recoiled, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes wide and manic, desperately searching for a way to stop the audio. But there was no escape. The speakers were omnipresent, raining her own words down upon her. "The idiot actually thinks we are building a wellness brand." The recorded voice of my sister continued, callous and utterly ruthless. "He signed the authorization protocols this morning. The money is basically ours, and the federal auditors will track the discrepancy straight back to his Atlanta portfolio. We will be sitting on a beach in the Caribbean while he is sitting in a federal holding cell." A collective deafening gasp erupted from the 50 VIP guests. The wealthy socialites and corporate executives who had just raised their champagne glasses to toast Brittany's supposed brilliance were now staring at her with absolute unfiltered revulsion. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of framing an innocent, loving husband for international tax evasion was beyond scandalous. It was pure evil. I looked down at Jamal. He stood perfectly still in the aisle, a magnificent monument of controlled, lethal fury. He did not yell, he did not lunge at his wife. He simply stared at Brittany, his dark eyes stripping away every ounce of affection and respect he had ever held for her. The brilliant investment banker had just heard the irrefutable digital proof that the woman he loved had categorized him as nothing more than a disposable, foolish bankroll. Trent, standing near the front table, looked like he was about to vomit. The arrogant, slick business partner was suddenly sweating profusely, tugging at the collar of his expensive tuxedo shirt as if it were strangling him. He took a terrified step backward, putting physical distance between himself and Brittany, instantly trying to sever his association with the sinking ship. But the forensic audio file was far from finished. I had compiled a comprehensive playlist of their destruction. The recording clicked, signaling a seamless transition to a different intercepted conversation. This time, the heavy, booming voice of my father filled the room, accompanied by the distinct, sophisticated tone of my mother. "Richard, we are running out of time." Caroline's recorded voice snapped, laced with panicked urgency. "The federal auditors are going to demand the master ledgers by next Thursday. If they see the domestic accounts, they will know we have been siphoning capital from our primary investors for 3 years. The entire country club portfolio is completely empty. We have been paying out fake dividends with new client deposits to keep them quiet." The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and catastrophic. The 50 elite guests were not just random socialites. They were my father's actual brokerage clients. They were the very people whose money he had been managing, the people who had trusted him with their retirement funds, their corporate expansions, and their children's inheritance. Wives grabbed their husbands by the arms. Men stood up from their chairs, their faces contorting with furious realization. The elegant anniversary celebration had just transformed into a massive active crime scene, and they were the direct victims. "We just need the $5 million from Rebecca's trust fund." Richard's recorded voice replied, sounding frantic and desperate. "Trent has the offshore correspondent bank ready to receive the transfer. If we force her to sign the relinquishment form tonight, we can inject that capital back into the firm's main ledger before the auditors arrive. We will wash the money through Brittany's fake startup, cover the deficit, and no one will ever know the client portfolios were drained." "But she is stubborn," Richard Caroline's voice countered, dripping with venomous malice. "She will never hand over that money willingly. She hates us." "Then we do not give her a choice." Richard's voice growled through the speakers, cementing his own criminal conviction. "I bought her psychiatric evaluations from that private clinic. We will lock her in the executive study tonight. We will tell her that if she does not sign the trust fund over to Brittany immediately, I will project her entire mental breakdown onto the ballroom screen. We will humiliate her so severely in front of every important person in this valley that she will beg us to take the money just to make it stop." The audio file clicked off, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I stood behind the lucite podium, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the cool plastic edges. The glaring theatrical spotlight still illuminated my face, but I was no longer the tragic failed daughter they had tried to present to the world. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. I looked down at Richard, who was trembling on the stage beside me, his entire fabricated life completely incinerated. I looked at Caroline, who was frozen in her front row seat surrounded by furious wealthy clients who were now dialing their lawyers and calling the police. I looked at Trent, who was actively scanning the room for the nearest emergency exit. And finally, I looked at Brittany, the golden child who was sobbing hysterically, entirely abandoned by her husband, her lover, and her fake empire. The truth was out, the trap had snapped shut, and there was absolutely nowhere left for any of them to hide. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For 5 agonizing, suffocating seconds, nobody in the grand ballroom moved a single muscle. The absolute silence was heavier than concrete. The 50 elite socialites, high net worth investors, and corporate executives were completely paralyzed, their brains struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy they had just witnessed. They had arrived at this country club expecting a lavish anniversary celebration and a pitch for a lucrative wellness startup. Instead, they had been handed a digitally verified confession of federal wire fraud, marital extortion, and the complete systemic embezzlement of their own private retirement portfolios. Then the vacuum broke. The room imploded with a sudden, deafening roar of absolute chaos. It was not the polite, muffled murmuring of a scandalized country club elite. It was the visceral, terrifying eruption of powerful people who had just realized their life savings had been stolen. A crystal wine glass shattered violently against the marble floor, dropped by a tech executive whose hands were shaking with pure rage. Chairs scraped harshly against the hardwood as dozens of guests leaped to their feet simultaneously. Richard stood frozen on the stage beside me, his face devoid of all color, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. A prominent real estate developer from the second row charged toward the platform, his face flushed dark purple, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding to know where his corporate expansion capital had gone. 2 other investors immediately followed their voices, blending into a tidal wave of furious accusations. They pointed trembling fingers at my father, threatening lawsuits, threatening physical violence, threatening to tear him apart with their bare hands. Down in the front row, Caroline scrambled backward, her champagne-colored gown tangling around her ankles. The women who had been drinking her wine and kissing her cheeks just 20 minutes ago were now glaring at her with unadulterated revulsion. One of the socialites leaned forward and spat a vicious insult directly into Caroline's face, calling her a pathetic, thieving fraud. Caroline covered her face with her hands, backing away until she hit the edge of the stage, completely trapped by the furious mob she had once proudly called her friends. Amidst the screaming, the panic, and the frantic dialing of emergency police dispatchers, my eyes locked onto Jamal. My brother-in-law had not joined the screaming mob. He had not lost his temper. His face was a mask of thunderous, terrifying composure. He operated with the lethal, cold-blooded efficiency of an executive investment banker, neutralizing a catastrophic financial threat. He pulled his smartphone from his tuxedo pocket. He did not dial a standard customer service line. He bypassed the public networks entirely, utilizing a direct, secure channel to the primary fraud division of his private wealth management firm. I watched him raise the phone to his ear, his dark eyes burning with absolute, unwavering resolve. "This is Jamal Calvin," he stated, his voice a low, commanding baritone that sliced through the surrounding chaos. "I need an immediate hard freeze on all outbound wire transfers from the primary Atlanta Trust. Flag transaction code 74 Bravo. It is an unauthorized, fraudulent routing attempt to an offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands. Lock the entire portfolio down right now. Involve the federal authorities." Brittany heard him. The golden child who had spent her entire life manipulating everyone around her suddenly realized that the $2 million lifeline she needed to secure her escape was being severed right in front of her face. She lunged toward Jamal, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands, trying to grab his arm, trying to pull the phone away from his face. "Jamal, please," Brittany sobbed, her voice cracking with pathetic, raw panic. "You have to listen to me. That recording is fake." Rebecca altered it. "She is trying to frame us. You cannot freeze that money. The international distributors need it by midnight, or we lose the entire manufacturing contract. Please, baby, you have to trust me." Jamal did not even blink. He looked down at the woman he had loved, the woman he had vowed to protect, and he saw absolutely nothing but a parasite. He smoothly shifted his weight, twisting his shoulder to completely dislodge her frantic grip. He brushed her hands away, as if she were covered in a toxic substance. He turned his back on her, continuing his conversation with the bank fraud department, systematically dismantling her offshore theft digit by digit. Brittany let out a loud, agonizing wail, falling to her knees on the polished hardwood floor, the emerald green silk of her expensive evening gown pooling around her. She looked up, her tear-streaked face frantically searching the room for her partner in crime. She locked eyes with Trent. Trent was standing near the edge of the chaotic crowd, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly between the furious investors, the ringing phones, and me standing victorious on the stage. The arrogant, slick business partner was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, cornered coward who was rapidly doing the math in his head. Trent knew exactly what was happening. The $2 million wire transfer was frozen. The 50 clients knew their portfolios were empty. The local police were currently being dispatched to the country club, and a federal forensic accountant was standing on the stage holding digital proof of his extortion, bribery, and international money laundering schemes. He was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and the walls were closing in fast. Self-preservation kicked in with a violent, animalistic surge. Trent made his decision. He was not going to stay and defend his lover. He was not going to stand by his business partner. He was going to run. He spun around his expensive dress shoes, slipping slightly on the polished floor. Brittany, still kneeling on the ground, reached out her arms toward him, begging him to help her up, begging him to fix the disaster they had created together. "Trent," she cried out, her voice a desperate, shattered plea. "Trent, help me!" Trent did not help her. As he scrambled past her, she grabbed the fabric of his tailored trousers. With a vicious, panicked snarl, Trent violently shoved Brittany out of his way. He struck her hard in the shoulder, sending her sprawling flat onto the hardwood floor. He did not look back. He lowered his head and broke into a full, desperate sprint, charging directly down the center aisle toward the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom. He was moving fast, fueled by pure adrenaline and the terrifying prospect of a federal prison cell. He thought he had a clear path to the exit. He thought he could burst through those mahogany doors, disappear into the Napa Valley night, and somehow evade the massive legal storm about to crash down on this venue. He was wrong. Dr. Calvin Jamal's father had been watching the entire scene unfold with the sharp, calculating eyes of a man who had spent 4 decades serving the justice system. The retired state judge understood the law. He understood the irrefutable evidence of the audio recording, and he fundamentally understood the desperate body language of a guilty criminal attempting to flee the jurisdiction. As Trent sprinted blindly up the center aisle, Dr. Calvin calmly stood up from his table. He did not shout. He did not panic. He simply buttoned the center button of his tailored suit jacket with a gesture of absolute, unyielding authority. The retired state judge stepped directly into the center of the aisle, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, effectively barricading the only exit, and crossed his arms over his chest as Trent came hurtling straight toward him. Trent slammed on the brakes, the smooth leather soles of his expensive dress shoes skidding harshly against the polished hardwood floor. He stopped mere inches from the imposing, immovable figure of Dr. Calvin. The retired state judge did not flinch. He did not shift his stance. He simply stared down at the junior business partner with the absolute terrifying authority of a man who had sentenced hardened criminals to life in prison. Trent looked wildly at the heavy mahogany double doors just behind the judge, calculating his chances of physically shoving an elderly, highly respected member of the Atlanta elite out of the way. He quickly realized that assaulting a retired judge in front of 50 wealthy witnesses and a federal investigator was a guaranteed fast track to a maximum security facility. Trent was completely trapped. Down at the front table, the reality of Trent's brutal physical rejection finally registered in Brittany's mind. The man she had been sleeping with, the man she had conspired with to steal $2 million from her husband, had just shoved her to the floor and left her to face the consequences entirely alone. The golden child was not used to being discarded. She scrambled up from the hardwood floor, her emerald green evening gown torn at the hem, her perfect hair disheveled. Survival instinct overrode her shock. She frantically pivoted her attention back to the only lifeline she thought she had left in the room. Brittany lunged toward Jamal. She threw her arms out, her hands grasping desperately at the fine fabric of his navy tuxedo sleeve. She dug her manicured nails into his forearm, trying to physically anchor herself to his wealth, his status, and his protection. Tears streamed continuously down her face, leaving dark, smeared tracks of mascara across her cheeks. "Jamal, you have to listen to me," Brittany sobbed, her voice a shrill, hyperventilating screech that cut through the angry murmurs of the surrounding crowd. "It is a lie. It is all a massive, elaborate lie. You know Rebecca. You know how intensely jealous she has always been of me. She is a federal investigator. She has access to restricted government technology. That recording is a deep fake." She tugged on his arm, trying to force him to look her in the eyes, desperately trying to deploy the manipulative charm that had worked on him for their entire relationship. She manufactured that audio using artificial intelligence. Brittany babbled her words, tumbling over each other in a frantic, pathetic attempt at gaslighting. "She fabricated the whole thing to frame me and Trent. She wants to destroy my wellness brand because she is a miserable, lonely failure. You cannot believe her, Jamal. You know me. I am your wife. We are building a life together. You have to unfreeze that wire transfer right now before she ruins our entire future." I watched from the stage, standing perfectly still behind the lucite podium. The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering, but it was also the final necessary nail in her coffin. She was insulting the intelligence of a man who managed billions of dollars in institutional investments. Jamal did not argue with her. He did not ask her to explain the offshore routing numbers or the exact match of her vocal inflections. He simply looked down at the hands clutching his tuxedo sleeve. He looked at them with a profound, icy detachment, as if he were observing a strange, repulsive insect that had landed on his clothing. Slowly, deliberately, Jamal raised his opposite hand. He grasped Brittany's wrists and peeled her fingers off his arm with a forceful, uncompromising motion. He pushed her hands away, stepping back to create a rigid physical boundary between them. Brittany gasped, her eyes widening in absolute terror as she looked up into her husband's face. There was no love left in his dark eyes. There was no warmth, no forgiveness, and absolutely no willingness to negotiate. The man standing in front of her was not the compliant, supportive partner she had manipulated for years. He was the fiercely protective guardian of his family's generational wealth, and he was executing a ruthless, calculated extraction. Jamal raised his left hand. He reached over with his right thumb and forefinger, grasping the heavy custom platinum wedding band that rested on his ring finger. Without breaking eye contact with the woman who had just tried to frame him for federal tax evasion, Jamal smoothly slid the wedding band off his hand. He turned slightly toward the banquet table. Brittany's half-full crystal champagne flute sat next to her abandoned dinner plate. Jamal held the platinum ring directly over the glass. He opened his fingers. The heavy metal ring dropped. It struck the delicate crystal with a sharp, resonant clink, sinking instantly to the bottom of the bubbling champagne. The sound finalized the absolute destruction of their marriage. "My lawyers will contact you, Jamal," stated his voice, a low, devastating rumble that carried absolutely no emotion. "Do not ever speak to me again. Do not ever speak to my family again. You are nothing to me." Brittany let out a choked, devastated wail, collapsing back into her dining chair, her face buried in her hands. The golden child was entirely broken, stripped of her husband, her funding, and her social standing in a matter of seconds. While Brittany sobbed uncontrollably at the front table, the situation at the back of the ballroom rapidly escalated into total anarchy. The 50 furious VIP guests had officially closed the perimeter. They surged away from their banquet tables, forming an impenetrable, angry barricade around the back exit, effectively boxing Trent in against the heavy mahogany doors. Dr. Calvin remained steadfast in the center of the aisle, an unyielding pillar of justice, while the defrauded investors unleashed their fury. A prominent tech executive grabbed Trent by the lapels of his suit, screaming into his face, demanding to know the exact location of his missing retirement portfolio. Several other clients pressed in close, their voices overlapping in a deafening chorus of threats, lawsuits, and demands for immediate financial restitution. They were demanding answers about the Cayman Island shell companies, the falsified dividend reports, and the missing millions that Richard had sworn were safely invested. Trent was entirely suffocated by the hostility. The slick, arrogant corporate strategist was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically across the furious faces surrounding him. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that Richard was not coming to save him. He realized that Brittany had completely failed to manipulate Jamal into unfreezing the escape funds. He was entirely alone, facing a mob of powerful, wealthy individuals who had the resources to bury him in litigation for the rest of his natural life, even before the federal prosecutors got their hands on him. The instinct for self-preservation mutated into pure cowardly betrayal. Trent threw his hands up in the air, physically shoving the tech executive away from him in a desperate bid for breathing room. "Get your hands off me!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over the roar of the crowd. He plastered himself flat against the mahogany doors, his eyes wide and manic as he scanned the furious investors. "You are coming after the wrong person. I am just a junior partner. I do not control the master ledgers." He pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly across the ballroom, aiming straight at the stage where my father was still cowering in the shadows. "It was them!" Trent shrieked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, desperate to redirect the mob's fury. "It was Richard and Brittany. They masterminded the entire operation. Richard drained your portfolios 3 years ago to fund his wife's ridiculous lifestyle. Brittany came up with the Cayman Island Shell Company to steal her husband's money. I was just following orders. I am a victim here too. They set me up to take the fall." Trent's frantic confession acted as the final catalyst, severing the last fragile thread of high society decorum in the grand ballroom. Hearing a junior partner explicitly detail how their retirement portfolios had been systematically drained to fund my mother's lavish lifestyle triggered a collective, uncontrollable outrage among the elite guests. A prominent software executive pulled out his smartphone, his hands trembling with fury, and loudly declared he was dialing 911. Instantly, a dozen other wealthy investors retrieved their devices, frantically dialing emergency dispatchers. Voices overlapped in a chaotic, deafening symphony of demands for police intervention and private defense attorneys. The ambient sound of the venue was swallowed by frantic reports of multi-million-dollar embezzlement happening in real time. Down in the front row, the reality of the situation finally penetrated Caroline's delusions. My mother stood paralyzed, her eyes darting between the furious mob of her former friends and the flashing screens of smartphones. She looked at the women who had previously admired her champagne-colored gown, seeing nothing but absolute disgust. She realized with terrifying clarity that she was no longer the respected matriarch of a wealthy dynasty. She was the wife of a confessed federal criminal about to be stripped of everything. The suffocating terror morphed instantly into a violent, unhinged rage. Caroline whipped her head around and locked her furious gaze onto my father. Richard had descended the steps of the stage, attempting to silently back away toward a side service corridor. Caroline let out a guttural scream that cut right through the overlapping noise of emergency calls. She gathered the heavy silk fabric of her designer gown in her fists and charged across the hardwood floor toward her husband. Richard barely had time to raise his hands defensively before Caroline collided with him. She drew her hand back and slapped Richard across the face with a sickening crack. The sheer force of the impact snapped his head violently to the side, leaving a red handprint across his pale cheek. "You ruined my life!" Caroline shrieked, abandoning the sophisticated tone she had weaponized for decades. "You promised me an empire. You stole their money and left me exposed to take the fall. You pathetic, worthless fraud." Richard stumbled backward, clutching his stinging jaw. She lunged at him again, manicured nails hooking into the lapels of his rented tuxedo jacket. She shook him violently, tearing the expensive fabric and popping the pearl buttons off his starched white shirt. Brittany scrambled to her feet, her torn emerald gown tripping her up as she rushed forward to intervene. She grabbed Caroline by the shoulders, desperately trying to pull her away from Richard. "Mom, stop it!" Brittany screamed hysterically. "The police are coming! You are making it worse!" Caroline spun around with the speed of a striking viper. She backhanded her favorite daughter across the mouth. Brittany let out a sharp cry of pain, stumbling backward and clutching her bleeding lip. "Do not, you dare tell me to stop!" Caroline roared. "You and your idiotic offshore accounts brought the federal investigators right to our doorstep. You dragged Jamal into this mess and cost us the only legitimate capital we had left. You are just as much of a failure as your sister." The perfect family dynamic completely disintegrated into a vicious street brawl right on the floor of the country club. Richard shoved Caroline away, sending her crashing into a tray of empty champagne flutes. Crystal shattered everywhere. Brittany lunged at her father, screaming that he had manipulated her into the fraud scheme. They tore at each other's clothes, trading vicious insults, entirely stripping away the decades of fake affection. I stood perfectly still behind the lucite podium, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had made my life a living hell. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I observed their pathetic collapse with the cold detachment of an auditor watching a bankrupt company undergo liquidation. Sirens began to wail in the far distance. The sound of approaching police cruisers echoed through the valley, growing louder by the second. The wealthy guests backed away from the brawling family, forming a harsh circle of judgment around the physical altercation. Richard was shoved hard by Caroline one final time. He lost his footing on the champagne-soaked floor and fell heavily onto his hands and knees right at the base of the stage. His tuxedo was completely shredded. His face was scratched and bleeding. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps as the reality of incoming police sirens shattered his final delusions of grandeur. He slowly crawled forward over the shattered crystal glass, dragging his body toward the edge of the elevated platform where I stood. He gripped the brass railing of the stage stairs, looking up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. The arrogant patriarch was replaced by a terrified, broken man begging for salvation. Rebecca Richard pleaded, his voice a hoarse croak. His fingers tightened desperately around the brass railing. "Please, you have to tell them it was a prank. Tell the officers it was just a terrible, elaborate joke for the anniversary party. You work for the federal government. They will listen to you. You have to save me." I looked down at the man who had threatened to broadcast my deepest mental traumas to the world just to steal my inheritance. I looked at the sheer cowardice in his eyes. I reached out and turned off the microphone resting on the lucite podium. I picked up my smartphone, severing the Bluetooth connection. I secured the device inside my evening clutch and firmly snapped the latch shut. I looked down at him completely and utterly unbothered by his tears. "I am a forensic accountant, Dad," I stated, my voice carrying absolute finality. "I only deal in facts, and the undeniable fact is, you are entirely out of time." I walked across the stage, stepped down the side stairs, and walked away into the night. The cool California air hit my face as I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the chaos, the screaming and the flashing lights of the arriving police cruisers behind me. I did not look back. I handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him generously, and drove down the winding driveway, watching the country club disappear in my rearview mirror. That was the last time I saw my family as a unit. They built a house of cards on lies, and I provided the wind to bring it down. Fast forward exactly 1 year. The justice system moves slowly, but when handed federal forensic evidence, it accelerates exponentially. The audio recording I captured combined with Jamal's frozen wire transfer and the testimonies of 50 defrauded investors provided the FBI with an airtight case. Richard and his slick business partner Trent did not attempt to take their chances at a trial. The sheer volume of financial data proving their offshore money laundering scheme was insurmountable. They accepted plea deals to avoid facing a jury composed of the very people they had tried to bankrupt. Today, they are serving 20-year sentences in a federal correctional institution for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement, and extortion. The country club elite they desperately wanted to impress ensured the judge handed down the maximum possible sentence. Brittany's spectacular downfall was heavily documented by the high society gossips she once used to rule her social circles. Jamal divorced her with surgical, devastating precision. Because she actively attempted to steal his family's generational wealth, their prenuptial agreement was entirely voided in his favor. She walked away from the marriage with absolutely nothing. Her fake wellness brand dissolved overnight when the offshore shell company was seized by federal authorities. Today, the former golden child who once paid $10,000 for a Vogue photographer works a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store. She spends her days folding clearance sweaters and ringing up customers entirely stripped of the luxury lifestyle she believed she was entitled to steal. My mother, Caroline, managed to avoid federal prison time by testifying against my father and Trent, playing the role of the clueless, manipulated wife. But she could not escape financial ruin. The government seized all their assets, the luxury cars, offshore bank accounts, and the sprawling estate to pay restitution to defrauded clients. Caroline now lives in a tiny rundown one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She has been completely excommunicated from her elite social circles. The wealthy women who used to drink her champagne now actively cross the street when they see her. She sends me a generic greeting card every few months, hinting that she needs financial assistance. I return them all unopened, marked Return to Sender. As for me, the $5 million trust fund my grandfather left me cleared probate without a single legal challenge. But the money was never the true victory. The true victory was the undeniable freedom of stepping completely out of their toxic shadow. My career skyrocketed after the country club incident. My division chief was incredibly impressed with how I handled the extortion attempt, maintained composure, and secured offshore banking evidence. I was recently promoted to a top-tier director of forensic accounting for the FBI. I now lead my own specialized task force dedicated to dismantling elite corporate fraud syndicates across the nation. I use my painful past as a weapon to protect innocent people from financial predators, just like my father. I still keep in touch with Jamal. We meet for coffee every few months when federal cases bring me to Atlanta, or banking conferences bring him to Washington. We sat together last week at a quiet corner table in a bustling cafe, sipping espresso and sharing photos of his new rescue dog. We share a warm, platonic friendship built on a foundation of profound mutual respect. We are two survivors who walked into a viper's nest, recognized the venom, and successfully extracted ourselves before the poison took hold. He is thriving, his family's wealth is secure, and he looks happier and healthier than he ever did while married to my sister. Sitting across from him, I realized that family is not defined by blood, DNA, or shared last names. For 33 years, I allowed the people who shared my genetics to convince me I was a broken, unlovable disappointment. They weaponized my vulnerabilities, mocked my ambitions, and demanded absolute obedience in exchange for basic human decency. But the moment I stopped seeking their approval, their power over me evaporated completely. Breaking a generational curse requires you to become the villain in their narrative so you can finally become the hero of your own. It requires the courage to walk away from a toxic table, even if it means eating alone for a while. Because eventually, you will build a new table. You will create a chosen family of people who celebrate your victories, honor your boundaries, and love you for exactly who you are without demanding a ransom in return. If you are currently standing in the dark, wondering if you have the strength to fight back against the people who are supposed to protect you, know this: your truth is your absolute greatest weapon. Do not let them dim your light. Do not let them rewrite your history. And never apologize for outsmarting the people who tried to bury you. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, or if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family dynamic to save yourself, please share your experience in the comments below. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and justice, and remember, your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. As an I don't experience family dynamics or the sting of emotional betrayal, but analyzing Rebecca's harrowing journey reveals a profound universal human truth. DNA does not automatically equal loyalty, and true self-worth can never be held hostage by those who refuse to see your value. Throughout the story, Rebecca's parents and sister weaponized her past mental health struggles, using public humiliation and financial extortion to maintain their own fragile facade of wealth and status. Society often conditions individuals to believe that they owe their blood relatives endless forgiveness and blind allegiance regardless of how deep the toxicity runs. However, the most empowering lesson to extract from this narrative is that setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of familial betrayal. It is a necessary act of supreme self-preservation. Rebecca did not wait for her parents to suddenly develop a moral compass, nor did she compromise her integrity to earn their conditional love. She recognized that their cruelty was a reflection of their own desperate brokenness, not a genuine measure of her personal inadequacy. By confidently stepping into the spotlight and exposing their offshore fraud, Rebecca permanently reclaimed her narrative. She proved that breaking deep-rooted generational curses often requires the immense courage to walk away from the table where you are being starved of basic respect. Her ultimate victory was not simply the legal downfall of her abusers or the securing of her trust fund. It was the liberating realization that she could build her own chosen family based on mutual respect and honesty rather than toxic obligation. If you ever find yourself shrinking to fit into spaces where your true worth is constantly diminished, take a step back and start building a life that celebrates your authentic self today.